Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a palace that no longer stands, in a city whose stone blocks have been worn down by time and sand, but whose name still echoes through history. Thebes, on the banks of the Nile. It is still dark outside. The air is cool, and the broad river moves in a slow, steady hush. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, donkeys shift in their sleep, and a few early boatmen push off from the shore, their poles scraping softly against wet wood and mud. Inside, oil lamps burn with small, steady flames, throwing warm pools of light on painted walls where gods and kings stride across plaster in eternal profile. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you want, you can leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Maybe it's late at night by the Nile of your own city, or early morning on the other side of the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a long, quiet corridor of the royal residence, bare feet on cool stone, listening to the layered sounds of a palace before dawn. Servants move like shadows, their linen garments whispering as they pass. A distant door creaks. Somewhere, a guard coughs softly and shifts his spear. You feel the familiar weight of a small leather pouch at your hip, filled with written spells and notes, and the faint scent of cedar oil and myrrh clings to your hands from the last time you prepared a remedy. You are not just another servant. In this palace, your role is both practical and sacred. You are a physician of the king, a Swen W, as the scribes would write, and that title binds your skill to the very health of the state. If the Pharaoh is strong, Egypt is strong. If his body weakens, if his breath becomes shallow, there are those who will say the gods are displeased, that order itself is fraying. You feel this knowledge sitting quietly in your chest like a stone. Outside, beyond the palace walls, the world is still a dark blur. Somewhere across the river, the cliffs of the West Bank loom, where tombs cut into stone wait for their royal occupants. Farther along the Nile, villages stir in their sleep, farmers, artisans, boatmen who will never see the inside of these polished halls. For them, illness is a matter of survival from season to season. Fevers after the flood, infected wounds from labor in the fields, snake bites in the reeds. For you, illness is something else as well. A puzzle, a message, a test of whether your understanding of the body and the gods is deep enough. In the cool stillness, you pause before entering the Pharaoh's private chambers. On the wall beside you, a relief shows the king making an offering to a lion-headed goddess, Sekhmet, who is both bringer and healer of plague. You know her well. Many physicians, especially those close to the court, serve as priests of Sekhmet, reciting hymns and performing rites to soothe her fierce power. In your mind, medicine is not divided neatly into separate boxes called religion and science, the way future scholars will sometimes imagine. Instead, there is only the great woven fabric of life, where a fever can be a sign of bad water, bad air, or bad favor with a god, or all three at once. You breathe slowly, feeling your heart beat steady in your chest. Somewhere in your memory, you hear an old teacher's voice from the temple house of life, reminding you that the heart is the center of the bodies, many channels that the vessels, the metu, carry air, blood, and other subtle forces from the heart to the limbs. When a channel is blocked, pain comes. When the heart is disturbed, the person is disturbed. You learn these things, hunched over papyrus, by lamplight, copying lines from older texts that were already old when your grandfather was a child. Historians far in the future will one day debate how much of this understanding is based on close observation and how much on symbol and belief, arguing over every fragment of papyrus they can find. To you, it is not an abstract question. It is the framework through which you decide whether a man will live or die. You draw the curtain gently aside and enter the royal chamber. Inside, the light is softer, filtered through hanging linen. The air smells of incense, beeswax, and the faint, earthy note of stone that never fully leaves these great buildings. A low bed stands beneath a canopy, draped in fine linen, surrounded by carved furniture, chests inlaid with ivory, and a gilded headrest shaped like a protective lion. On that bed lies the man whose name will be carved into temple pylons and rock-cut tombs, whose cartouche will be circled by eternity. But right now, to your eyes, he is simply a human body at rest, breathing in and out. Perhaps he has been slightly unwell in recent days. A persistent pain in the side, a stiffness in the joints, a heaviness behind the eyes. Perhaps he is entirely well, and you have been called merely to examine, to reassure, to confirm that the divine body is as sound as the priests say the kingdom is. You approach quietly, placing your hands where you have placed them before. At the wrist, feeling the pulse, near the chest, feeling the rhythm of breath. You look at the color of the nails, the clarity of the eyes, the moistness of the lips. You listen to the quality of his sleep, to the way he shifts beneath the sheets. Your examination is not as detailed as what physicians centuries later will perform, but it is not careless either. You have seen enough wounded soldiers and sick children to recognize the difference between ordinary fatigue and the first edge of something serious. A scribe stands nearby, reed pen in hand, ready to note anything you say. He represents another thread in the web you inhabit, the world of writing and record. Somewhere, in a scroll, stored carefully in a chest, someone has recorded that this particular pharaoh's physician examined him on this particular day. Other scrolls, much older, list treatments for burns, fractures, coughs, stomach pains, and mysterious wandering pains that move around the body. The texts are half recipe, half ritual. If you find a man with such and such a symptom, you shall say, "This is a matter I can treat, and you shall do thus and thus." You know those formulas by heart. You also know that no two bodies are exactly the same, and that some patients recover even when you are not sure why, while others slip away despite everything you have done. In the quiet of this room, with the future of Egypt breathing steadily before you, that uncertainty feels sharper. You straighten, give a small nod, and murmur a report low enough that only the scribe and the attending servant can hear. If there is a concern, you shape it carefully, not to frighten, but not to hide. If there is reassurance to give, you offer it, knowing that a king's mind, like any other, is affected by fear and ease. Outside, the first pale line of dawn is beginning to brighten the edge of the sky, promising another day of petitions, ceremonies, decrees, and offerings. That day will unfold whether or not you feel completely ready. The palace will wake fully, courtiers will gather, priests will intone hymns before statues of the gods, and you will walk these corridors again, moving between the rooms of the royal family and the quieter inner chambers, where you keep your boxes of resins, jars of honey, bandages of clean linen, and scrolls inked with the condensed wisdom of generations. For now, though, as you step back from the bed and let the curtains fall softly into place, you hold the mixed awareness that always lives in your mind, the closeness of the divine and the frailty of the human body, the power of your knowledge and the limits you know all too well. It is this tension between certainty and uncertainty, ritual and observation, that will shape every decision you make as the Pharaoh's doctor in the days to come. When the palace corridor grows too quiet and the weight of the king's breathing feels very close, your mind, almost by instinct, slips backward in time, like the Nile flooding and then retreating to show older layers of silt. You are no longer a respected physician with a leather pouch at your hip. You are once again a thin, wide-eyed boy being led toward the temple by your father, the air cool against your bare shoulders, your heart beating fast with a mixture of dread and pride. The temple rises ahead of you like a small mountain of stone, columns painted with bright colors that will fade slowly over centuries, but are still vivid on this morning. This is not just a place for offerings and incense. Somewhere behind those walls lies the Per-Ankh, the house of life, where texts are copied, rituals are studied, and the knowledge that supports the kingdom as much as grain and stone passes from one generation to the next. You step through the great gate and feel the world change. Outside are mud brick houses, market noise, bleating goats. Inside, The sound softens into the murmur of priests, the rustle of linen, the scratch of reed pens. You are not fully sure, at first, whether you belong here. Most of the boys entering training will become scribes of some kind, recording harvests, court cases, temple offerings. You too will learn to write, because in Egypt, healing is tied tightly to writing. The same hand that traces out hymns for the gods will copy prescriptions for stomach pain. The same eyes that read myths of creation will learn to recognize the signs of a bad wound from an old case written down centuries before you were born. The first lessons are not about herbs or bandages, they are about patience. You sit cross-legged on a reed mat, a wooden tablet on your lap, a crude writing board smeared with a thin layer of plaster. In your hand is a reed pen, freshly cut, its tip awkward between your fingers. A teacher walks slowly down the line of students, correcting grip, posture, angle. You copy simple signs over and over again. A seated man, a loaf of bread, a twisted flax rope. The sacred script that once seemed like a wall of tiny drawings begins, painfully slowly, to resolve into sound and meaning. Later, when you have earned enough trust to handle real papyrus, you will be allowed to copy more complex texts in the flowing, practical hieratic used for everyday documents. You will feel the fibers of the papyrus under your hand, slightly rough, and smell the faint, dry scent as you roll and unroll each sheet. At first, the texts you copy are wisdom teachings, sayings, advising obedience, moderation, humility. The instructions of long-dead officials tell you that the tongue can ruin a man faster than any illness, that one should be calm, patient, respectful of superiors. These lessons sink into you along with the shape of the signs, weaving moral order together with the discipline of the hand. Only gradually do the subjects change. One day your teacher places a different kind of document in front of you. The heading is familiar to him but new to you. It names a case, an ailment, sometimes even gives a little story. If you examine a man with a wound to his head, the text that follows does something you have never seen before. It tells you how to examine, what to look for, what it might mean, and what you should say about whether the man can be treated. Later scholars far in the future will give these scrolls names like the Ebers papyrus or the Edwin Smith papyrus and argue about their dates and sources. To you, they are simply the writings of the ancestors, voices preserved in ink. You learn that some cases are described as an ailment I can treat, others as an ailment with which I will contend, and some, more grimly, as an ailment for which nothing can be done. Alongside these sober notes sit lists of ingredients: honey, natron, beer, fat, plant resins, minerals ground to powder. Honey, your teacher emphasizes, is not only sweet, but protective. It helps a wound stay clean. Natron dries, oils soften. Some plants ease pain. You grind them in stone mortars with aching arms, learning that a physician's work is as much about preparation and physical labor as it is about insight. But the House of Life is not a medical school in the modern sense. At some hours you stand in a dim chamber, reciting hymns to Thoth, the god of wisdom, and to Seshat, the goddess of writing, asking them to steady your hand and sharpen your understanding. At other hours you copy spells where words themselves are medicine, meant to drive out the invisible forces that twist a man's belly or cloud his mind. You do not experience a sharp boundary between diagnosis and incantation. In your world, correct words, correctly spoken, help align the patient with order mart, just as surely as a poultice aligns a broken limb. Sometimes, you accompany an older priest-physician into the outer courtyards, where the common people come seeking help. You watch him listen, touch, observe, and then choose a treatment. He asks about the patient's work, about what they eat, about when the pain began. You notice that he does not always rely on the scrolls. Sometimes he improvises, drawing on experience. Later, back in the archive rooms, you read older cases and see how often your teacher quietly disagrees with them, choosing different remedies. It is your first hint that even in a highly traditional culture, knowledge shifts and grows. Future historians will debate how many specialized doctors there really were in Egypt, and how far their authority extended beyond temple and court. They will point out that priests, magicians, and household healers all shared parts of the same terrain. From inside your own life, the debate feels less clear-cut. You are trained as a scribe, as a ritual expert, and as a practitioner who must decide what to do with a swelling, a burn, a stubborn cough. Your identity flows among these roles, like the river among its channels. Years pass. You grow taller, your shoulders broaden, your hair is shaved and regrown according to ritual cycles, and your hands lose the clumsy stiffness of childhood. You begin to recognize patterns in the cases you see. Men who work bent double in fields often complain of the same lower back pains. Those who carry sacks of grain develop similar sore shoulders. At certain times of the year, after the flood recedes, more people come with stomach troubles and fevers. You do not have the language that later centuries will use to speak of microbes or parasites, but you notice these rhythms and carry them quietly in your mind. You also begin to grasp the cost of mistakes. One afternoon, a child is brought in with a serious head injury from a fall. Your teacher examines him, following a procedure that has been written down for generations, checking whether he can speak, whether his pupils respond to light, whether he can move his limbs. The child's breathing is shallow. A bandage is applied, a poultice prepared. That night, the child dies. No curse is blamed. No priest storms about in anger. There is only a stillness in the house of life, and a new layer of seriousness settles into you. Knowledge, you realize, is not a charm that guarantees success. It is a way of facing uncertainty with structure and care. In the scriptorium, the light from high windows falls onto long tables where scrolls are unrolled and weighed down with small stone pegs. In the storage rooms, chests hold papyri, wrapped carefully against dust and insects. You help organize them. Texts on rituals, on temple property, on myths, and on remedies. The smell of dry papyrus and ink becomes as familiar to you as the smell of river mud. You begin to sense, dimly, that these papers form a kind of extended mind for your civilization, keeping what no one person could remember. By the time you are finally recognized as a full physician, able to treat patients on your own, the temple and its house of life have left deep marks on your inner world. You have learned to see a body as a network of channels radiating from the heart, and as a vessel for invisible forces that must be balanced and appeased. You trust in honey and bandages, and you trust in words that have been spoken for centuries before you. You know what your teachers have taught you, and you know, quietly, that there are edges where that knowledge grows thin. It is with this mixture of confidence and humility that you will one day be summoned from the cool shadow of the temple to the brighter, more dangerous light of the palace. But before that day arrives, you stand for a moment in the courtyard, the sun warming your shaven head, and feel a simple, steady awareness. You belong now to a line of healers whose names may never be carved on monuments, but whose thoughts will seep into every remedy, every scroll, every careful touch on the pulse of a living king. As your training deepens, the world around you begins to rearrange itself into patterns. What once felt like separate domains, gods in their shrines, stars turning above, bodies ailing below, start to braid together into a single, intricate cord running through your mind. You move through the temple with a new awareness, sensing that every image on the wall, every statue in a niche, every line of text on papyrus is quietly teaching you how to think. In the early mornings, before the main crowds of worshippers arrive, you stand in the courtyard of Amun's temple at Karnak in Thebes, watching the sky pale over the great pylons. The columns around you are carved with scenes of pharaohs making offerings, but your eyes drift upward to the stars slowly fading in the brightening blue. A priest of higher rank, serving as an observer of the hours, points out certain stars near the horizon, naming them with titles that sound like tiny hymns. You learn that at night, the hours are sometimes measured by the rising of groups of stars, the decans that appear in sequence along the eastern sky. On some tomb ceilings, star clocks have been painted so that even in darkness, scribes and priests can imagine the march of the hours. Here, in the open air, you see that the same pattern of lights guides the timing of rituals, festivals, and even certain treatments. If an illness worsens at a particular time of night, your teachers take note. They speak not of invisible germs, but of the relationship between the patient's body and the flow of cosmic order. When the star Sopdet, known to others as Sirius, makes its first reappearance at dawn after a period of invisibility, the temple stirs with special energy. This heliacal rising, as later scholars will call it, heralds the coming flood of the Nile, the great swelling that brings both danger and life. You stand among the gathered priests, feeling the fine hair on your arms lift as the first bright point appears near the horizon. To them, and to you, this is not only a sign of water levels, it is a reminder that the heavens and the river, the sky and the soil, the calendar and the circulation of blood in a man's veins are all linked in a vast, balanced design. Inside the house of life, the link between this cosmic order and the individual body is drawn more explicitly. Your teachers tell you that the heart is the center of a network of metu vessels, or channels that carry not only blood, but also air, tears, mucus, and more subtle forces. You copy passages that say, in effect, all vessels come from the heart, and you see how illness is often described as a disturbance, blockage, or misdirection in these pathways. You have never cut open a living person to trace these channels as later anatomists will. Dissection of the dead for study is not a common practice. Bodies belong to the realm of funerary specialists and priests, and the idea of cutting into them simply to look and learn feels dangerous, even impious. Yet you are not entirely ignorant of what lies beneath the skin. You have seen, from a distance, and sometimes more closely, the work of embalmers on the West Bank, near the necropolis of Thebes. There, in houses of purification, the deceased are prepared for their journey to the afterlife. Organs are removed, treated, sometimes placed in special jars under the protection of 4 sons of Horus, or later returned to the body after being preserved. You note the shapes of these organs, their textures, their placements as best you can, without overstepping your role. From such glimpses, combined with inherited descriptions in older texts, you build an inner map: heart, liver, lungs, intestines, all serving as stations along the routes of the body's channels. When you touch a patient's chest, you feel you are placing your hand on the very hub of this system. The heart is not just a pump to you, it is the seat of thought, memory, and intention. In funerary texts used in tombs across Egypt, the heart is what will be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth and order, before Osiris in the Hall of Judgment. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, the soul is lost. So when you consider the health of a person's heart, you are thinking not only of their circulation, but of their moral and emotional state as well. Historians many centuries from now will argue about how far your people's anatomical knowledge truly went. They will analyze fragments of papyri like those later called Ebers, London, Cahoon, and debate whether phrases about the vessels of the heart show close observation or symbolic thinking. From inside your own life, the distinction feels less sharp. You believe that to understand a person's illness, you must know both the layout of their inner pathways and the pattern of their place in the universe. This belief shapes how you respond when a patient falls ill under an ill-omened sky. Suppose a nobleman comes to you complaining of a tightness in the chest, a sense that his breath will not fully come. You listen to his story, examine his pulse, observe the color of his skin. Then, in your mind, you also consider the recent movement of certain stars, the timing of recent rituals, the mood in the temple. Has there been a lapse in offerings? Has a festival been delayed? Is Sekhmet being properly appeased? You do not think this way because you dislike practical causes. You know that bad water can sicken people, that spoiled grain can cause stomach pains, that certain marshy regions produce more fevers. You have watched workers on the great projects of the New Kingdom temples. Royal tombs fall ill after long days in the sun. At Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb workers on the West Bank, scribes sometimes record absences from work due to sickness or injuries. These notes, mundane as they may seem, Reinforce your sense that fatigue, exposure, and bodily strain are real, tangible factors. But you also live in a mental world where the pharaoh's health is tied to the balance of the cosmos. If the king falls ill at a time when stars are out of position, or festivals have been disrupted by political trouble, it feels impossible not to see a connection. In your thoughts, the gods, the stars, and the organs inside a man's chest form a triangle of influence, each side supporting and reflecting the others. At night, when the temple is quieter and the air cools, you sometimes climb to a rooftop or step into an open courtyard again to look up. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a white river. In some stories, it is associated with the celestial Nile. In others, with the goddess Nut arched over the world. You let your eyes follow its faint, grainy band and imagine that, just as these countless small lights make up a larger whole, the many tiny observations you've made of pulses, breathing patterns, symptoms might someday form a more complete picture of the body. You do not know that future cultures will separate astronomy from medicine, anatomy from theology, as if they were distinct disciplines. For you, the healer's mind must be able to think in both directions at once, outward, toward the great cycles of sky and flood and festival, and inward, toward the private corridors of muscle, vessel, and heartbeat. Sometimes, when a treatment works unexpectedly well, you wonder which of these directions mattered more. Was it the careful mixture of honey and herbs placed on a wound, or the prayer spoken softly over it? Was it the timing of a purge to coincide with a favorable hour, or the fact that the patient finally rested in a quiet, shaded room? You rarely get a clear answer. Instead, you carry a layered sense that healing is never only one thing. Even within your own temple, you hear low-voiced debates. One teacher stresses correct ritual above all. Another insists on close observation of symptoms and outcomes. Some priests lean heavily on spells. Others claim that a good physician can often work without them. Listening to them, you begin to realize that your world contains not one, but many ways of being a healer, all coexisting under the same painted ceilings. This awareness becomes part of your inner landscape when you walk from the starlit courtyard into the lamplit archive, from the embalmer's district back to the palace clinic. Your thoughts are just like eyes moving between darkness and brightness. You carry within you a map that is at once anatomical and cosmic, practical and mythic, and it is this inner map that will guide your hand when you next place your fingers lightly on the pharaoh's wrist and listen for the quiet music of his pulse. By the time the patterns of stars and vessels have settled into your thinking, the world of healing has become not only an idea in your mind, but a set of smells that cling to your skin and clothes. If you close your eyes, you can almost find your way through the temple precincts by scent alone. You step into the small chamber where medicines are stored and prepared, near but not inside the main sanctuary. The air is warm and close. Shelves of wood and stone hold jars of differing shapes, some of fine alabaster, some of plain clay, with small labels or simple marks indicating their contents. When you lift one lid, the sharp, clean bite of natron rises up, drying the inside of your nose. Another jar offers the thick sweetness of honey, golden and slow. Baskets hold bundles of dried plants. Grinding stones rest in shallow basins, their surfaces worn smooth by years of work. Here, you are not thinking about celestial decans or funerary judgments. You are thinking about a woman at the door with a burn on her arm from a cooking fire, or a farmer with a cracked heel that will not heal, or a boatman whose eyes sting and water after long days in the sun. Their lives are humble, their names likely never to be written on a monument, but their pain is immediate and real. You begin with the simple cases, under the watchful eye of an older physician-priest. For the burn, you recall a well-known procedure. You cool the skin gently, then prepare a salve with honey and fat, perhaps with a plant resin that will soothe and protect. Honey, you know from long experience now, helps a wound stay clean and moist. It is mentioned over and over in the old scrolls, and you have seen burns treated with it heal better than those left dry. When you apply the mixture, your fingers move carefully, spreading it just enough, wrapping it in fine, clean linen. The woman's face eases a little as the pain dulls. For the cracked heel, you think of oils, castor oil, thick and distinctive in its smell, is one option. Animal fat softened with plant ointments is another. You kneel, examining the fissures in the skin, and speak gently, asking how long he has worked standing in water, how long he has walked on rough ground. You suggest rest where possible, although you know it may not be. The practicality of poverty presses against the practicality of medicine. The temple courtyard outside is busy. Thebes, during the height of the New Kingdom, perhaps in the reign of a ruler like Amenhotep III, or later Ramesses II, thrums with activity. Messengers come and go between Karnak, Luxor, and the palace. Artisans and labourers cross paths, with noblemen carried in litters. Yet in this small medical chamber, the world narrows to the texture of skin under your fingers, the weight of a pestle in your hand, the thin scratch of a scribe's pen recording a particularly noteworthy case. Sometimes you treat eyes. Egypt is a bright land, full of reflected light from water and sand, and many people come with irritated, inflamed eyelids. You know the recipes for soothing salves, mixtures of fat, honey, and mineral powders ground fine, applied carefully along the lid, eye paints made with galena or malachite, which women and men alike use for both beauty and protection, seem to help shield against glare and dust. You are aware that some mixtures are risky if made incorrectly. You have seen cases where a poorly prepared compound worsens the irritation. You store those memories carefully, small warnings etched into your mind. The smell of incense drifts constantly through this space, carried from the inner sanctuaries where priests make offerings to the gods. Frankincense, myrrh, and other resins crackle over small charcoal fires, their smoke curling along the ceilings. It mingles with the more earthly scents of oils and herbs, wrapping your work in a veil of sanctity. For the patients who come here, the line between temple and clinic is blurred. To them, your touch is both medical and priestly. Your words are both instruction and prayer. When a mother brings a feverish child, she may hand him to you with a plea to the god more than to the man. You listen to the child's breathing, feel the heat of his skin, note the dryness of his lips. You think about the season. Is it after the inundation, when mosquitoes thrive and fevers are more common? You think about what he has eaten and drunk. You decide on a treatment. Perhaps a purgative drink, made from plants known to clear the stomach. Perhaps a cooling compress. At the same time, you speak words that have been used in similar situations for generations, asking the protective gods to drive out whatever malevolent force is troubling this small body. Later readers of medical papyri will be fascinated by the way your remedies combine such elements. They will note that texts like the Ebers papyrus, compiled around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, contain hundreds upon hundreds of prescriptions, some straightforwardly practical, others heavily infused with magic and incantation. Some modern scholars will argue that the magical elements were simply a cultural shell around core rational practices. Others will insist that, for you, spell and salve were inseparable. You know only that, in the quiet urgency of a sick room, you use every tool you believe may help. You grind herbs with care because you have seen them reduce swelling. You recite words preserved from old scrolls because you have seen people relax and breathe easier under their cadence. You wash a wound with wine or beer because experience has shown you that dirty water can worsen infection. You bandage with linen that has been boiled clean. Somewhere in this combination, many patients improve. Occasionally, a remedy strikes you as odd, even by your own standards. Some prescriptions call for ingredients that are difficult to obtain or ethically troubling. Others instruct the use of substances whose value you do not clearly understand. You and your colleagues sometimes quietly set those aside, preferring treatments that have proven themselves in practice. At the same time, you remain aware that what seems strange today might, in some circumstances, show its worth tomorrow. Tradition, observation, and humility all jostle within your thinking. One set of instructions you copy describes placing bread on a wound that has lingered too long. The text is old, its language slightly archaic. You dutifully transcribe each line, even as a part of you wonders why stale bread should help. Much later, far beyond your imagining, scholars will look at such passages and speculate whether the use of old bread, sometimes bearing visible mold, might have unintentionally introduced substances that slowed infection. They will argue, agree, and disagree in their own time. For you, the question remains open. You keep such recipes in your toolkit of possibilities, watching closely how patients respond. In the outer courtyard, incense burns before a statue of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, whose breath is said to be the hot wind of plague, and whose favor is sought to end epidemics. When a cluster of people begins to arrive with similar symptoms, perhaps a strange cough spreading among workers, or a fever that strikes several households along the same street, fear stirs in the community. Offerings increase. Priests chant more intensely before her image. You, meanwhile, find yourself grinding more of certain herbs, preparing more poultices, and listening more carefully to patterns in the stories people tell about where they have been and what they have eaten. Nothing in your world tells you to choose between praying to Sekhmet and noticing that those who drink from one particular canal seem sicker. You do both. You recommend different water if you can. You suggest that those who are not yet ill avoid certain as yet unclean places. You speak to temple authorities about cleaning or redirecting a water source. You also join the priests in offerings, because in your mental map, the goddess Wrath and the tainted canal are two faces of the same disturbance in order. As you move through these days, mixing oils, tying bandages, breathing incense, you come to understand the texture of everyday suffering in a way that palace officials rarely see. You learn how poor families stretch small supplies of grain, how workers push themselves to exhaustion to fulfill royal building projects, how mothers fear not only death but disability that would leave a child unable to work. All of these realities shape what healing can mean. Sometimes it is the removal of pain. Sometimes it is simply making a burden lighter, buying a little more time. In the evenings, when the temple quiets and the last patients have gone, you wash your hands in cool water scented faintly with lotus. The smells of the day linger on your skin. A trace of myrrh, a hint of honey, a ghost of burnt incense. You feel tired in a deep, simple way. The kind of fatigue that comes from standing between other people and their suffering. Yet you also feel, beneath the tiredness, a growing sense of capacity. Each small case, a burn soothed, an eye eased, a fever reduced, is another thread in the knowledge you will one day carry into the palace, to apply in a place where the stakes will be far higher, but the bodies, in the end, are just as fragile. The day the palace truly enters your life does not announce itself with trumpets. It begins like many others, the air cool before the sun gathers strength, the temple courtyard bathed in soft grey light, you checking the jars in the medicine room, breathing in the familiar blend of natron and honey. You are thinking about a patient you saw yesterday, a worker with a deep bruise on his shin, when a shadow falls across the doorway. You look up to see a man in fine linen standing there, his kilt pleated more neatly than most, a small gold ornament at his neck, catching the dim light. He carries a staff, not the heavy staff of a labourer, but a lighter, more symbolic one of someone who moves between worlds. His gaze meets yours, and you feel a small, unexpected tightening in your chest. He names you, clearly and without hesitation. Then he adds a title you have not heard spoken in quite this way before. Physician of the palace. Not physician of the temple, not scribe of the house of life, but something that links your skill directly to the seat of royal power. A priest-physician of higher rank appears at your shoulder, and for a moment they speak over you, exchanging formal phrases, invoking blessings on the king whose name they both utter with careful respect. You stand very still, feeling as if the ground under your bare feet has shifted. The messenger's words are simple. The Pharaoh has requested examination. The king's household desires an additional physician present. The temple recommends you. On the surface, it is a practical matter, one more healer called to the service of the court. Beneath that surface, you sense deeper currents. To be summoned to the king is to step into a realm where health is not merely a personal matter, but a question of cosmic balance and political stability. You are given time only to collect your pouch, a few carefully chosen jars, and a small roll of papyrus with notes and spells you find most helpful. The messenger leads the way out of the temple, past the massive pylons of Karnak, where scenes of the king smiting enemies and offering to the gods are carved in deep relief. You have passed through these gates countless times, but today their scale feels different. The figures of the Pharaoh on the walls are larger than life, striding forward with divine confidence. Soon, you will touch the actual body of the man they depict, or his near successor, in a line that stretches back for centuries. Thebes in the New Kingdom is a city alive with motion. As you follow the messenger through its streets, you see porters carrying baskets of grain, scribes bent over wooden tablets, women letting water jars down into wells. The smell of baking bread and animal dung blends with the ever-present dust. Somewhere nearby, musicians are practicing for a festival. The faint notes of flutes and sistrums drift through the air. You have walked these streets many times on small errands, but today, you feel as if everyone can see the new weight on your shoulders, even though, outwardly, nothing about your appearance has changed. To reach the royal residence, you must cross the Nile. In this period, the king keeps palaces on both banks, ceremonial structures near the great temples on the east, more expansive residences on the west, like the sprawling complex at Malkata, built by a ruler such as Amenhotep III. The messenger guides you to a waiting boat. You step in carefully, feeling the gentle rock under your feet as the boatmen push off. The river's broad surface glitters in the growing light, the eastern bank receding as the western cliffs draw nearer, their pale faces already warming to gold. For a moment, as the boat glides through the water, you let your eyes soften and your breathing slow. The Nile has been the spine of your life, its cycles of inundation and recession marking the rhythm of years. Villages rise and fall along its banks, kings come and go, festivals flare and fade, the river endures. You silently ask it to carry you well in this new role, as if the slow current could lend you some of its steady composure. On the far bank, you disembark and follow the messenger up toward the palace. The complex sprawls like a small town of its own. Courtyards, painted colonnades, side buildings for stores and workshops, gardens where trees cast delicate shade over pools of water. Walls are decorated with scenes of foreign tribute, hunting, festivals, moments of royal life presented in orderly, perfected form. You know that beyond these images lies a more complicated reality. Internal politics, shifting alliances, the constant negotiation between powerful officials. You also know that, once you step fully into this world, your success or failure with a single patient could echo through conversations you will never hear. The gate you approach is guarded, spears gleam, shields lean against the wall. The messenger speaks with the chief guard, names you again, and mentions the temple that sends you. That connection matters. Palace and temple are woven closely together. Kings are crowned and buried, with strong religious framing. Priests serve as advisors. Your status as a House of Life-trained physician and priest of a healing deity gives you a sort of passport across this threshold. Still, as the guard finally nods and steps aside, you feel a flicker of unease. Inside, the sounds change. The noise of the outer city fades into a quieter hum. The soft scuff of sandals on polished floors, the murmur of servants, the distant splash of a fountain. The air smells different too. Less of animals and dust, more of perfumed oils, incense, and the faint tang of plaster and paint. Light slants through high windows and falls onto brightly painted scenes along the corridors. You pass depictions of the king in a chariot, bow drawn, the king seated in a kiosk, receiving envoys, the king embraced by a god. As you walk, you think of the difference between the ordinary lives you have treated in the temple and the life that unfolds here. Pharaohs of this age preside over campaigns into Nubia and Asia, oversee vast building projects at Karnak, Luxor, and the West Bank mortuary temples like Medinet Habu. Their names are carved deep into stone, their images repeated again and again. Yet beneath the crowns and regalia, their bodies are flesh like any other. They tire, they ache, they suffer from digestive troubles, from tooth pain, from mysterious fevers that do not yield easily to known remedies. You are led through a series of courtyards and halls, each more restricted than the last, until finally you reach an antechamber near the royal apartments. A senior official meets you there, his face composed but intent. He asks a few questions not about your feelings, but about your training. Have you served as a physician for noble houses before? Are you familiar with certain procedures for wounds, for chest pains, for disturbance of the heart? You answer calmly, drawing on years of experience, careful not to exaggerate. Inwardly, you are aware that your words now are a kind of first treatment, not for the king's body but for the court's faith in you. When at last you are admitted to the royal chamber, the shift in atmosphere is subtle but unmistakable. Servants stand at the edges of the room, poised, watchful. A scribe is in place with his writing kit. An older court physician already sits nearby, his expression neutral, weighing you with his eyes. And on a bed of carved wood, covered in fine linen, lies the Pharaoh. Perhaps he is in his full vigor, troubled only by a nagging pain. Perhaps he is older, his joints stiff from years of ritual striding and chariot riding. Many specific details of such moments are lost to history, and later scholars must reconstruct them from tomb art, letters, and skeletal remains. You, however, are living it, and to you, he is simply your patient. You approach as you have approached many others, with a respectful greeting, with a calm voice, with hands that have learned to move steadily under pressure. You touch his wrist, feel his pulse, you listen to his breathing. You ask, gently, about the nature of his discomfort. The words he uses are not so different from those of a laborer with chest pain or a scribe with a throbbing head. Pain, after all, democratizes. Yet every small choice you make here carries more weight. If you suggest a certain regimen of rest or diet, it will affect the scheduling of ceremonies and audiences. If you recommend a particular purification or offering to a god, it may set a tone that the court will interpret in terms of favor and omen. You recall how the old medical texts differentiate between an ailment I can treat and an ailment for which nothing can be done. Here, admitting the limits of your art feels like a much more delicate task. In a quiet corner of your mind, an interpretive voice whispers the part of you that has listened to debates among your teachers. It tells you that the royal body is not only a physical fact but a symbol, that every illness of a king becomes a canvas on which others project fears and hopes. Some future scholars will argue that Egyptian physicians were constrained by religion, others that they were surprisingly empirical within those bounds. You stand at the point where those frameworks meet, making decisions not as an idea in a book but as a living person, in a room where incense curls up and the ruler of a great kingdom watches your face for clues. You finish your initial examination, withdraw a little, and confer softly with the older court physician. You are careful to show respect, to suggest rather than insist. He, in turn, listens more closely than you expected, recognizing perhaps that the House of Life has given you experience with cases beyond the palace walls. Together, you settle on a course of treatment, part changes in diet, part physical remedies, part ritual actions to reassure king and court alike. When you leave the chamber, the air in the antechamber feels different. The messenger who first summoned you gives the slightest nod, as if to say that some invisible gate has swung further open. You walk back through the colonnades and courtyards, across the river, toward the temple where you began. Yet you know that something fundamental has shifted. From this day forward, every time you grind herbs or copy a medical spell, you will feel, in the background, the steady breathing of the palace, a reminder that your knowledge now moves in circles where a single misjudgment could ripple outward in ways no scroll has ever prepared you for. In the days that follow your first visit to the royal chamber, your life falls into a new rhythm. The palace messenger's arrival no longer feels like a rupture but like the turning of a familiar gear. You are summoned in the cool early hours, sometimes again at midday, sometimes in the blue dimness just after sunset. Each time, you pass under carved scenes of the king smiting enemies or presenting offerings, and each time you remind yourself that, before you lies, not a mythic figure painted in profile, but a body that must be read with the same careful attention you once gave to the bruised shin of a worker or the burn on a cook's arm. You learn the small signs of the pharaoh's moods. On some mornings, his voice carries easily across the room, the sentences short and crisp, his humor sharp. On others, he speaks more slowly, his hand moving unconsciously to a shoulder that aches, or to a chest that feels tight. In an age like the New Kingdom, the time of rulers such as Amenhotep III or Ramesses II, a king spends long hours in ceremonies, in audiences, in chariot rides during festivals. Age, injuries from hunting or battle, and the sheer strain of standing as the fixed point around which the kingdom turns, all leave their marks. As you approach the bed, your senses sharpen. The room's fragrance of incense and perfumed oil is familiar now, but you have learned to notice when it is used more heavily than usual, as if to mask the sour edge of fever sweat or the faint odor of a wound. The fine linen sheets that cover the king rustle differently depending on whether he shifts easily or with guarded, careful movements. What to a courtier might seem tiny variations in demeanor are, to you, letters in a living script you are constantly trying to read. You begin with the pulse. Your fingers find the artery at the wrist, pressing gently, then more firmly, then easing back, letting your skin learn the rhythm. The medical texts you copied in the House of Life do not describe pulse-taking in the detailed way later traditions will, but your teachers emphasize the importance of feeling the heart in every vessel. Over years of practice, your hands have learned to distinguish between the quick, feathery beat of someone frightened, the slow, heavy thud of someone exhausted, and the irregular stutter that tells you something deeper is wrong. You watch the chest as it rises and falls. Is the breath shallow or deep, smooth or labored? Does the king pause to catch his breath after a short sentence? You listen to his voice for hoarseness or strain. You note the color of his lips, the moistness of his eyes, the way he holds his neck and shoulders. All of these observations feel small by themselves, but together they build a picture that is both bodily and symbolic. For the pharaoh's body, in Egyptian thinking, is a sacred object. It is the living image of Horus, the earthly pillar of Maat. Illness here is never just an individual misfortune. It is a disturbance that touches the entire web of the kingdom. Sometimes, you ask questions that might seem trivial to those listening at the edges of the room. How did you sleep? What dreams came? Did you wake suddenly during the third watch of the night? Dreams, in your training, are not mere private fantasies. They are messages that may come from the gods, from the dead, or from a part of the self that speaks more freely when the body rests. There are dream books, like the one preserved centuries later in what will be called the Chester Beatty Papyrus, that offer interpretations. To dream of certain animals is good, of others bad. To see oneself in particular situations can mean victory or danger ahead. You do not take these guides as rigid rules, but you keep them in mind. If the king reports a disturbing dream during a period of physical weakness, you are especially attentive. You may recommend specific rituals, offerings to a god such as Sekhmet or Thoth, to calm whatever unseen agitation has surfaced. From your point of view, this is not a separate task from checking his breathing or preparing a herbal draft. It is another way of reading the signs on the sacred body, listening not only to blood and breath, but to the way his sleeping mind is reacting to the pressures of rule. You do not shy away from less exalted details. At appropriate moments, you inquire about appetite, about digestion, about stools and urine. The old medical texts include careful descriptions of changes in color, consistency, and frequency, and you rely on these as much as on the more dignified indicators. If the king's belly is distended, if he complains of pain after certain foods, you think of rich festival meals heavy with meat and wine, of sedentary hours sitting on thrones, of the tendency of status itself to invite excess. Your remedies may involve purgative drinks, adjustments to diet, increased movement where possible. You have seen what happens to men who ignore these signs until they become crises. At times, you must examine the skin more closely. You draw back linen to check for swellings at the joints, for unusual discolorations, for persistent sores. In doing so, you are acutely aware of the boundary you cross. This is not a laborer's scarred leg or a child's rash. This is a body that has been wrapped in ritual from birth, its parts protected by layers of etiquette and reverence. You move with extra care, your voice low and respectful, yet your eye stays clear. Reverence cannot be allowed to cloud diagnosis. The older court physician still works alongside you. In quieter moments, you confer in a screened corner of the chamber or in a side room, comparing impressions. He leans more heavily on certain tried and true remedies. You sometimes bring in approaches you have seen in the temple among poorer patients. Together, you decide which old practices to repeat and where you might cautiously innovate. Later historians will wonder to what extent Egyptian physicians experimented beyond inherited formulae, and to what extent they simply obeyed tradition. In these discussions, you can feel both tendencies at work, tradition as a stabilizing force, and observation as a quiet, persistent pressure toward change. When the king's symptoms are mild, a stiffness that eases with massage and oil, a brief fever that breaks after a night, you leave the chamber with a sense of relief. The palace atmosphere lightens, officials move more briskly, priests speak of favorable omens. In such times, your role feels almost invisible, like the fine threads holding a garment together. Few outside the innermost circle know exactly what you did. They only know that the king rises strong, that rituals proceed on schedule, that Egypt's image of itself as ordered and protected remains intact. When the signs are more troubling, a persistent cough, a pain that grows rather than recedes, a wound that stubbornly refuses to close, the tension in the room thickens. You feel it when you enter, the way servants avoid meeting your eyes, the way the scribe sits already prepared, understanding that whatever you say will be written down, perhaps preserved long after the body before you has gone to the west. You re-examine, re-ask questions, search your memory for similar cases. You consider not only plants and poultices, but also the timing of festivals, the state of political affairs, the recent stories whispered in the corridors. Illness in a ruler always invites interpretation beyond the physical. There are days when, after repeated examinations, you must quietly classify what you see as an ailment with which I will contend, knowing that your chances are uncertain, or even an ailment for which nothing can be done, though you may not speak it in exactly those words where courtiers can hear. You continue to treat, to comfort, to arrange rituals that soothe both body and mind. You also begin, gently, to prepare those closest to the throne for the possibility that even a king's body is subject to limits. At night, back in your own quarters, you lie awake sometimes, thinking of his pulse under your fingers, of the slight catch in his breath. You picture the great reliefs at Karnak or Luxor, showing him eternal and strong, smiting enemies beneath his feet. The contrast between those fixed, ageless images and the living man you have just examined presses heavily on your chest. Future scholars will argue about how Egyptians reconciled such exalted portrayals with the obvious mortality of their rulers. You feel that tension not as an abstract question, but as a quiet ache when you wash your hands and watch the day's herbs swirl away in the wash basin. And yet, amid the pressure, there is a steadying element. The more often you read the signs on this sacred body, the more you see how similar they are to the signs on every other body you have treated. A king's heart quickens with fear or anger, just as a peasant's does. A noble's joints creak in the morning, just like those of an old boatman. The vessels, the breath, the pathways of pain and relief, all follow patterns you have traced back through years of work. In recognizing this, you find a kind of groundedness. So each time you step into the royal chamber, you bow to the symbols, respect the protocols, listen for hints of divine displeasure, but you also return, again and again, to the simple, human task. Lay your hand on the pulse, watch the rise of the chest, ask about dreams, note the color of the skin, and try, with everything you have learned from temple, tomb, stars, and scrolls, to read the story the body is telling you before it is too late. There comes a point, after many examinations and long evenings of quiet worry, when you realize that every time you listen to the king's pulse, you are performing not one task, but two. Outwardly, you are checking the state of his body, the warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his breath, the strength of his heartbeat. Inwardly, you are weighing a different question. How much of what you see is the work of ordinary forces? Food, age, injury, and how much might belong to the realm of the unseen? This question is not unique to the palace. You have faced it before when a farmer arrived with a pain that wandered from limb to limb without clear cause, or when a child's fever failed to break despite all the herbs and cool cloths you could offer. But here, in the king's chamber, the stakes are raised. If the pharaoh coughs, is it because of dust in the air, strain from shouting commands, a chill caught on the river at dusk, or is it a whisper of displeasure from a god whose offerings have been neglected? A sign that some spiritual balance has tilted out of place. In your training, you learn to move cautiously between these possibilities. The old medical texts you copied later generations will call one of the greatest of them the Ebers papyrus, contain both practical recipes and explicit spells. A single case history might begin with a description of symptoms, move on to a prognosis, and then conclude with a written enchantment to be spoken over the remedy. You shall say over this, "Come out, enemy, who enters through the mouth, who creeps behind the eyes." The words are old, their exact phrasing sometimes shifting from copy to copy, but the pattern remains. Illness is both physical invasion and hostile presence, something that can be soothed with poultices and driven out with speech. In the palace, you find yourself drawing on these layers in a more deliberate way. If the king complains of pain in his chest after heavy meals, if his belly feels tight and his bowels sluggish, your mind immediately brings up recipes involving castor oil, figs, beer, and various purgative plants. You recommend changes in diet, arrange for lighter foods, suggest specific times of day for movement and rest. You may even, with the authority your position now affords, quietly speak to those who prepare his meals, asking them to be cautious, to avoid certain excesses. In such cases, you think of the ailment as primarily a matter of the body's channels, blocked, slowed, burdened. But there are other moments. Suppose the pharaoh begins to complain of pains that come and go with no clear pattern, or of nightmares that leave him agitated, his heart racing, with no obvious physical trigger. Suppose a rash appears suddenly and then fades, only to return on certain days. Suppose the timing of these changes coincides with strange events in the temple, an accident during a ritual, a bad omen seen in the flight of birds, a statue's eye paint flaking in a way the priests find unsettling. In those moments, you feel the palace watching you not only as a doctor, but as an interpreter of omens. The older court physician may lean more heavily on established rituals, offerings to Sekhmet to avert plague, to Thoth to restore balance to the king's faculties, to Hathor to soothe his mind. You do not resist these measures. You have seen too many patients relax, too many muscles unclench, when they are told that proper offerings have been made and the gods appeased. Fear, too, is a kind of poison in the body. If an image of Sekhmet receives extra incense and the king's anxiety lessens, that in itself is a kind of medicine. At the same time, you continue to observe. You ask quietly about what the king has eaten, how long he has stood in the sun during ceremonies, whether he has recently rode or hunted, whether he has spent more time than usual bending over documents with his scribes. You notice that one particular pattern of nightmares follows evenings heavy with wine. Another seems tied to days of intense political strain, when news from distant borders has been troubling. In your mind, the unseen and the seen are never entirely separate. Illness could be a god's arrow, yes, but perhaps the arrow flies straighter when the body is already weakened by overwork or indulgence. Sometimes, you prescribe a remedy that combines both aspects in a single act. You might prepare an amulet inscribed with a short charm, to be worn on the chest near the heart, while also providing a drink meant to cool and calm. You know that certain stones and metals have long associations with protection: carnelian, jasper, gold. The amulet is carved and blessed in the temple, the words spoken with care. When you place it around the king's neck, you do so with a steady hand, feeling that for him, the sense of being guarded may be as important as any plant in the draft you've prepared. There are also more elaborate procedures. For certain stubborn ailments, the texts instruct the making of small figurines or drawings of harmful forces, which are then cursed, broken, or buried, what future scholars will recognize as a kind of execration magic. You do not necessarily perform these yourself. Often they fall to priests, whose entire role lies in managing such rites, but you understand their function: to give shape to the unseen enemy so that it can be symbolically defeated. When a king participates in such a ritual, even quietly, it can help restore a sense of control in the face of persistent, mysterious suffering. Modern readers, centuries ahead, will sometimes look at this blend of spell and salve and ask whether Egyptian medicine was really scientific. Some will argue that the physicians of your era were surprisingly rational, that they observed and recorded symptoms carefully and used effective natural substances. Others will emphasize the magical formulas, the appeals to gods and demons, seeing your practice as more religious than medical. From where you stand, sitting at a low table, grinding herbs by lamplight, or standing at the king's bedside in a dim chamber, such debates would feel oddly narrow. You know that the body is influenced by what it eats, by the heat of the sun, by the bite of insects, and the quality of water. You also know that fear, guilt, and the sense of being cursed can twist a person's sleep and appetite as surely as any infection. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, when the king's complaints have been vague but insistent, you find yourself alone in a small side room of the palace. Scrolls spread before you. You reread certain passages you have copied many times before. Remedies for a heart that is weary, for a belly that rebels, for a patient whose limbs are seized without visible cause. Some descriptions match what you have seen almost perfectly, others only partially. You take a reed pen and make small notes in the margin, not contradicting the ancient author, but adding quiet reminders to yourself in older men. This sign appears more often, or this draft works better if given after the second hour of the morning. In that moment, you feel the presence of those who wrote before you, and of those who will come after. The lines of ink on papyrus form a chain of minds, each adding a little, each shaped by the same mixture of observation and belief. You imagine, briefly, a future healer reading your own editions, weighing them, perhaps altering them again in the light of their own experience. Knowledge, you realize, is itself an unseen force, moving through time like an invisible current, changing form as it passes from hand to hand. Back in the royal chamber, you continue to walk the narrow path between the visible and the invisible. You check pulses, listen to breath, press gently on tender places, prescribe herbs and diets. You also recommend offerings, authorize amulets, consult dream interpreters when necessary. You do not see these as contradictions. To you, they are strands in a single rope, a rope you cling to as you stand beside the bed of a man whose health is tied, in the minds of his people, to the rising of the sun and the steady flow of the Nile itself. And so, when you leave the palace at the end of such a day, stepping once more into the open air, where the night breeze smells of river and dust, you carry with you the sense that your work is never only with flesh. It is with fears, with hopes, with stories, with gods glimpsed in dreams and invoked in whispered names. Each diagnosis you make is an attempt to locate illness within that wide, invisible web, and each spell you speak, each remedy you mix, is a small, careful gesture toward restoring a balance that stretches far beyond the limits of any single body, even that of a king. For all the hours you spend weighing unseen forces, there are days when your work becomes starkly, undeniably physical days, when the body's inner map is revealed in lines of blood and broken bone, leaving little room for dreams or omens. Those are the days when men are carried to you rather than walking in on their own feet, and the smell of incense in the air must compete with the sharp metallic tang of fresh wounds. Sometimes they come from the palace training grounds, young nobles thrown from chariots, soldiers whose practice with real weapons has gone suddenly, frighteningly wrong. Sometimes they come from far beyond the city walls, from battlefields where the king has led campaigns into Nubia or against Hittite forces in Syria, as rulers like Thutmose III or Ramesses II are known to have done. At other times, they arrive from the monumental building sites along the Nile tombs in the cliffs of the West Bank, pylons rising at Karnak, where stone can slip, ropes can snap, and a single misstep can turn years of ordinary labor into a moment of catastrophe. On such days, there is no question of whether the ailment comes from a god's displeasure or bad water in a canal. The cause stands naked before you: a crushed hand, a gash across the scalp, a leg bent at a wrong angle. Pain has its own fierce clarity. You remember your training in trauma most vividly. The old surgical text you studied later ages, we'll call it the Edwin Smith papyrus, was different from many other scrolls. Its language was brisk, its organization methodical. Case after case described injuries to the head, neck, shoulders, chest, and spine, each with a step-by-step examination and a conclusion about whether the physician will treat, will contend with, or will not treat the ailment. There were no elaborate spells attached to those entries, only the terse, practical voice of someone who had seen too many such wounds to waste words. Now, when two soldiers carry in a third whose skull has been struck by a falling stone, that voice echoes in your mind. You have them lay the man on a low pallet in a well-lit corner. You crouch beside him, your knees protesting, and begin to examine. Is he conscious? Does he speak clearly? Or does his tongue stumble over simple words? You ask him his name, where he is, what happened. Do his eyes follow your finger when you move it from side to side? Are his pupils equal, or does one seem strangely narrow or wide? You run your fingers gently over his scalp, feeling for soft spots, for fractures in the bone. You check whether he can move his hands and feet, whether his breathing is shallow or deep. Each detail you note pulls the case toward one conclusion or another. In your mind, you line it up with earlier cases. If the skull is only bruised, if the man can speak and move all his limbs, you classify it as an injury you can treat. If there is a depression in the bone, if his speech is slurred, if he cannot use his legs, you know you are entering more dangerous territory. The old text spoke in calm terms even about grim outcomes, reminding you that skill lies not only in trying to heal, but in recognizing the limits of intervention. For injuries you judge treatable, your hands move quickly. You wash the wound as best you can with water, wine, or beer, flushing out dirt and fragments. You recall how the older texts sometimes advise applying fresh meat on the first day to help stop bleeding and swelling, then following with honey and bandages in later days. You do not always follow these instructions exactly. Over time, you have found that some wounds respond best to immediate cleansing and honey, whose protective properties you have seen again and again. But the principle is clear: clean, protect, support. You place honey-soaked linen carefully over clean wounds, smoothing the fabric so there are no folds where corruption can hide. For deeper gashes, you may bring the edges together with strips of linen, or, in some cases, with fine stitching, using a needle and thread of plant fiber, or possibly even metal. You are cautious. Too tight, and the wound will pull and tear. Too loose, and it will not close. When the dressing is in place, you overlay it with further layers of linen, tying them in such a way that they remain secure but can be changed without disturbing the injured flesh too much. Broken bones present a different challenge. A laborer is brought in one afternoon with his forearm crooked at an angle that makes even the most hardened among you wince. You control your own reaction, knowing that your calm is a part of the treatment. You feel along the arm, gently but firmly, identifying the break. You think of the instructions you once copied, to place it in its proper position and bind it with splints and bandages. With the help of assistants, you pull carefully, aligning the bones as best you can by feel. The man cries out, gripping a wooden stick until his knuckles whiten, sweat beading on his forehead. You murmur reassurances, not empty words, but small anchors in the storm of his pain. Once you are satisfied that the bones are more or less straight, you apply padded splints, wooden or reed pieces along the length of the arm, then bind them with layers of linen. The goal is simple: keep the fragments still so that the body's own healing can knit them together. In the village of Deir el Medina, where royal tomb workers live in tightly packed houses along narrow lanes, Such fractures are not rare. Records from that community, preserved centuries later, will show absences from work due to sickness or injury, along with rations provided during recovery. You have treated men like that, watching the slow return of movement over weeks and months. You have also seen bones that never set correctly, leaving limbs shortened, crooked. Those cases stay with you, reminders that even when life continues, the cost of injury can be permanent. In the palace context, the pattern is similar, but the consequences ripple differently. If a high officer's leg is broken, work details must be reassigned, certain diplomatic missions delayed. If the king himself suffers a serious wound, say, during a lion hunt, or while driving a chariot at speed, the entire kingdom feels the tremor. The reliefs carved on temple walls always show the pharaoh triumphant and unscathed, striking enemies and returning in glory. Your knowledge of flesh tells you that the truth can be more complicated. In the most severe cases, spinal injuries, wounds where bone splinters pierce deep into the body, you must make decisions that weigh heavily on your conscience. The old surgical text does not encourage futile heroics. If a patient lies motionless from the neck down, if their breathing is shallow and their eyes vacant, the recommendation may be to recognize that an ailment for which one cannot treat stands before you. That does not mean abandoning the patient. It means understanding that your role shifts from cure to comfort, from trying to repair to trying to ease the passage toward death. You have had to do this more than once. You remember a young soldier whose back was crushed under a chariot wheel, who could no longer move his legs. You cleaned his scrapes, bound his bruises, gave him mixtures to ease his pain, and arranged for him to be cared for by his family. You did not promise what you could not deliver. In your notes, you recorded the case in steady script, but the memory of his face, his question, "Will I walk again?" stays with you long after the ink dries. Later scholars will sometimes praise Egyptian medicine for its practicality in trauma and surgery, noting how closely certain case descriptions resemble modern clinical reasoning. Others will point out that, even here, magical spells appear in some contexts, that ritual and medicine were rarely separated completely. From your vantage point, bent over a wounded arm under the flicker of a lamp, such distinctions feel less important than whether the bandage will hold through the night and whether the patient's fever will stay low. There is, however, one thread that connects these rough, bloody moments to the more contemplative parts of your work. A steady respect for the body's capacity to heal itself when given the right support. You align bones, but you cannot fuse them. You clean wounds, but you cannot knit skin. You ease breathing, but you cannot command the heart to beat. The body does these things, or it does not, according to patterns you only partly understand. Your role is to create conditions that favor that hidden work, to remove obstacles, dirt, misalignment, infection, so that the inner labor can proceed. So when another injured man is carried in, when you once again wash your hands and reach for the familiar grinding stone or the smooth, cool splint, you do so with practiced hands and a mind that holds many layers at once. The old surgical cases, you memorized as a student, the individual before you now, the knowledge of what will happen if this arm or leg does not mend. In your thoughts, there may be a brief prayer to Sekhmet for mercy, but your fingers, moving with careful precision, are the most immediate litany. And later, when you return to the palace to check on a king, nursing a smaller injury, a strained muscle from drawing a bow, a shallow cut on his hand, you bring with you the same steady hands that have set bones and stitched flesh in the humbler corners of Egypt. In that way, the lives of anonymous workers and the life of the pharaoh are joined in your practice, all of them bodies subject to force and fragility, all of them entrusted, for a time, to the quiet, disciplined movements of your craft. For all the sharp, singular crises of broken bones and crushed limbs, there are seasons when suffering does not arrive one body at a time. It comes instead like the Nile itself when it overflows, its banks not as one wave, but as a slow, rising flood that seeps into every corner of life. Those are the times when people fall ill, not in ones or twos, but in tens and twenties, and you find yourself standing in the middle of something both familiar and terrifyingly vast. It begins quietly enough. A messenger arrives from a nearby village with a simple report. More people than usual are sick with fevers and coughs, some too weak to work. At first, it seems no more than the natural variation you have seen before. After the inundation, when standing water and insects are plentiful, you expect a certain number of fevers. After very high or very low floods, when food supplies are strained, you expect stomach troubles and weakness. Egypt has lived with such rhythms for centuries. But then a second messenger comes, this time from the workmen's village on the west bank Deir el-Medina, where the tomb builders and artists who carve the royal necropolis live in their tight rows of houses. He brings word that several men at once have failed to report to their tasks, cutting chambers into the cliffs for a king like Ramesses II or his successors. The scribe of the crew records absences as ill, fever, sick in his house. You have seen these notations before on ostraca and papyrus, but now they cluster more thickly along the lines, a pattern of strain emerging even in the records. Soon, the temple courtyard, where you usually see a slow, steady trickle of patients, begins to feel crowded. People arrive with similar complaints: heat in the head and chest, aching limbs, a dull heaviness behind the eyes, sometimes a cough that shakes the whole body. Some can still walk. Others are carried by relatives. Their faces blur into one another. Farmers, potters, boatmen, women who sell bread in the market, all marked by the same flushed skin and unfocused gaze. You ask your usual questions. When did the fever start? What have you eaten? Where do you get your water? And the answers begin to overlap. Many drink from the same canal. Many live in low-lying houses close to stagnant pools left by the flood. Some have been working on the same building site, sleeping close together in crowded lodgings. In your mind, the channels of the body and the channels of the landscape begin to echo one another. As the metu of the heart can become blocked or overheated, so too can the waterways and airways of a community. The temple responds, as it has been conditioned by centuries of tradition. Priests increase offerings to Sekhmet, whose lioness gaze can bring plague or hold it back. During certain times of the year, especially near the end of the calendar cycle, great efforts are made to appease her feasts, processions, recitations of hymns. The idea is simple and powerful. If the goddess' fiery breath is the source of pestilence, then cooling her anger may cool the fevers in men's bodies. You participate in these rites, chanting among the ranks, smelling the dense incense smoke that gathers beneath the high ceilings. At the same time, you feel a different urgency that does not easily fit into ritual. You go to the village or send trusted assistants to examine how people are living. You notice cramped sleeping spaces where families lie close together on hot nights, coughing into each other's faces. You see jars of water drawn from canals where animals also drink and defecate. You see food stored in ways that invite insects and spoilage, especially after difficult years when grain is scarce and must be stretched further than is wise. Later scholars will pore over texts like the admonitions of Ebers and other pessimistic writings, debating whether they describe historical plagues and famines or use them mainly as literary warnings. They will also examine mummies and bones from your era, finding evidence of chronic conditions, arthritic joints, damaged spines, perhaps even traces of diseases like smallpox or tuberculosis etched into bone and tissue. They will argue about which specific epidemics struck, about whether references to pestilence in inscriptions match identifiable diseases or are more generalized laments. For you, in the midst of an outbreak, such debates are distant shadows. You see only the lines of people at your door and the way entire work gangs or streets seem to thin at once. In response, your work shifts from individual care to a kind of rough public medicine. You try to separate the very ill from those not yet feverish when space allows. You urge families to keep cool cloths on the heads of the burning, to encourage drinking when they can swallow, to keep flies away from eyes and mouths. You ask local officials to improve the cleaning of certain canals, to remove rotting refuse from crowded alleys. You know your authority is limited. You are not a vizier or a high priest. Yet you also know that a word from a palace physician, especially one who serves the king's household, can carry weight if you use it carefully. Back in the temple, you review your scrolls. The large compendia of remedies, like the one later called the Ebers papyrus, contain many recipes for fevers of the body, for illness that burns. Some are clearly practical, mixtures meant to cool, to encourage sweating, to ease pain. Others are more concerned with naming and expelling the unseen entity believed to be causing the heat. You select those that seem most appropriate, balancing availability of ingredients with what you have seen work before. Honey, herbs, beer, water, oils, you combine them in different ways, making notes on which combinations bring relief and which fail. You are aware that your efforts are imperfect. Some patients improve, others do not. In one house, 3 children survive. In the house next door, the youngest dies while the eldest recovers, leaving patterns that defy easy explanation. You see that those who are already weakened by hunger or overwork are more likely to fall seriously ill. You see that households with more space and cleaner water seem to fare better. You see that fear itself can drain a person, leaving them less able to fight off whatever is passing through the community. In the midst of this, the palace cannot remain untouched. Servants who go in and out of the king's household come from the same city, drink from the same river. You watch closely for signs that the sickness is moving inward. When a minor official develops a fever, your examination of him carries extra intensity. When a royal child coughs in the night, you are called more quickly. The possibility that this rising flood of illness might reach the central pillar of the state, the Pharaoh himself, hangs over every decision you make. There are, thankfully, times when the wave crests and then begins to recede. The air dries, standing water shrinks. People change their habits a little under the memory of recent losses. The temple celebrates renewed favor from Sekhmet. Thanksgiving offerings are made, hymns sung with special fervor. You share in these rites, grateful for any story that helps a shaken population feel that order has been restored. Yet a quieter part of your mind remembers the practical changes as well. The cleaned canal, the new instructions about boiling water in certain quarters when possible, the adjustments in how workers sleep during dangerous seasons. Historians in distant centuries will argue about how conscious your society was of contagion, about whether Egyptian physicians understood that illness could pass from person to person through invisible agents. They will point to passages suggesting that disease was sometimes thought to enter through the mouth and nose, to move from one house to another, and they will debate how literal or metaphorical such language was. You, walking through streets that a week ago were noisy and are now strangely quiet, see enough of the pattern to act cautiously. You may not speak of infection in the language of later science, but you do advise distance, cleanliness, and avoidance of certain places when sickness is thick in the air. When at last the number of new fevers drops, when the lines at the temple gate shorten, when the scribes at Deir el-Medina record fewer absences as ill, you feel a slackening in your own chest. The invisible flood has begun to retreat. Houses mourn their dead, but the living return to the fields and workshops. The king appears in public again, without obvious sign of illness, and the city's confidence stitches itself back together. In the quiet that follows, you sit one evening in a shaded corner of the temple, scroll on your lap, and try to write down what you have learned, not for the gods this time, but for whoever might read your hand in years to come. You note the season, the pattern of symptoms, the places most affected, the remedies that seem to help. You do not pretend to full understanding. Instead, you offer future eyes, what you yourself have needed most. Fragments of experience, arranged into some sort of order. You know that another such season will come someday. The Nile will flood again, insects will breed again, people will crowd again into close spaces, and illness will find its paths. When it does, some healer, perhaps trained in a house of life, not unlike your own, will unroll a papyrus, run their finger along your lines, and feel a faint, steadying connection across time. And though they may live in a slightly different Egypt, with different rulers and even different gods emphasized in the temples, the problem before them will be much the same. How to face a rising, invisible flood with limited tools, steady hands, and a mind that refuses to surrender entirely to either fear or false certainty. In quieter seasons, when the fevers ebb and the bones you have set are knitting in their bandages, you might be forgiven for thinking that your work has become almost straightforward. A pulse is steady or not, a wound is clean or inflamed, a draught brings relief or does nothing at all. But the longer you serve in the palace, the more you realize that, here, the human body is never just flesh and channels. It is a node in a web of power, and every change in the king's health sends faint tremors along invisible lines that connect courtiers, priests, generals, and royal wives. You begin to notice it in small observations. When the pharaoh is strong and visible riding in his chariot during festivals at Luxor, standing beneath tall banners at Karnak, receiving foreign envoys in the great audience hall, the faces around him are open, confident. Officials stand tall in their white linen, their shaved heads gleaming, their voices firm. Servants move with brisk efficiency. The palace feels like a well-tuned machine, everyone sure of their place. But let the king suffer a bout of illness, nothing dramatic at first, perhaps just a stubborn pain in the chest or a lingering cough, and something in the air changes. Conversations hush when you enter a room. Messengers from distant garrisons or vassal cities are kept waiting a little longer. High-ranking officials gather in corners more often, their heads bent close together. The domestic staff becomes more watchful of your comings and goings, as if the number of times the king's physician is summoned in a day were itself a kind of report on the state of the kingdom. You realize that your words, spoken calmly at the bedside, "The king should rest," or "his pain is easing," or "this will take time, do not stay in that room," they travel outward on the lips of scribes and attendants, changing shape as they go. By the time they reach the ears of a general commanding troops on Egypt's northern border, or a high priest of Amun overseeing sacrifices at Karnak, they may have become, "The king is weak," or "The king is recovering," or "The king is in danger." You do not control these transformations. You only feel their consequences. Sometimes, the consequences are subtle. A delay in announcing a major building project, extra emphasis in public rituals on the king's vitality and divine protection, rumors in the city that he has been seen less often in the open. At other times, they are sharper. You notice that certain officials press you for information more directly. A chamberlain asks, with an almost casual air, whether the king has been sleeping better. A royal wife, perhaps not the great royal wife, but a secondary consort whose sons have ambitions, asks whether the king's pains are the sort that return or the sort that pass. You answer carefully, always speaking truth as you know it, but weighing every word. You have learned that a single phrase, "he tires easily," or "his strength returns slowly," can be used as a tool in arguments you will never hear, in rooms where succession and policy are discussed. Later, scribes in a far-off future will preserve records of great court intrigues, such as the conspiracy that arose in the reign of a king like Ramesses III, when members of the harem and certain officials plotted to alter the line of succession. Those records will list judges and accused conspirators, spells, and accusations. Your name, or the names of men like you, may not appear in such documents, but your presence hovers at the edges. In any struggle over the future of the throne, the person who attends to the king's body is never entirely neutral in the eyes of others. No matter how hard you try to be, you learn to read the palace not only through pulses and fevers, but through glances. When the king's health falters, some courtiers appear more solicitous than before, hovering near his chamber, offering to fetch this or that. Others keep a deliberate distance, as if unwilling to be too closely associated with either decline or recovery until the outcome is clearer. Priests of different temples, Amun at Karnak, perhaps Re at Heliopolis, or local cults, step forward with their own proposals for rituals to restore royal vigor. To them, the illness may be proof that their god's favor is needed more strongly, that their rites should be given greater prominence. You stand in the middle of these currents, trying to keep your footing. Your primary loyalty, as you feel it, is to the patient on the bed and to the craft you have spent your life learning. But here, loyalties are never that simple. The vizier, the king's chief administrator, may call you privately and ask for an honest assessment of the monarch's chances of full recovery. A general may hint that the army needs to know whether its sovereign will be able to lead campaigns in person next season. A royal son, not yet the crown prince but close enough to dream of it, may watch your face with particular intensity whenever you leave the king's chamber. You begin to understand that, in this environment, failure is not just unfortunate. It can look, to some, like betrayal. If the king dies after a long illness, there will be whispers. Did the physicians do enough? Did they choose the right remedies? Did they over-rely on certain rituals and neglect others? Did they perhaps favor one potential heir over another, subtly shaping their treatments in ways only they could see? You know how inaccurate such suspicions can be. You know the nights you have spent awake, rereading scrolls, rethinking every potion, every bandage, every word of encouragement or caution. You know the cases where you have pushed your own body to exhaustion, going from the king's bedside to the wards of servants and workers, then back again, trying to keep illness from spreading through the palace like a fire through dry reeds. Yet you also know that doubt moves quickly in closed spaces, and that people under strain look for causes they can name. There is an added danger, the fear of poison, of deliberate harm disguised as sickness. Letters and inscriptions from across the late Bronze Age speak of envoys and princes who died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths followed by accusations of treachery or sorcery. In Egypt, too, the possibility that a rival might seek to harm the king through tainted food, drink, or incantation is never entirely absent from the palace imagination. In such an atmosphere, your role as examiner of the royal body, as observer of what goes in and what comes out, makes you both valuable and vulnerable. If the king falls suddenly ill after a particular meal, eyes turn toward the kitchens, the cupbearers, and also toward you. Was the ailment truly sudden, or did you miss earlier signs? Could certain antidotes have been given sooner? If a ritual is performed to identify a sorcerer, you may be asked to attest whether the symptoms fit natural patterns or something stranger. The truth is that, from where you stand, the line can be hard to draw. A stomach that tightens in poisoning can resemble one gripped by infection or stress. A delirious fever can be caused by tainted water as easily as by imagined curses. In these moments, you must speak carefully. You cannot lie about what you see. Your training and your own conscience forbid it, but you can describe degrees of certainty. You can emphasize what is known and what is not. You might say, these signs are often seen after spoiled food, or such dreams sometimes accompany high fevers, without rushing to name a human enemy. Whether others will accept that measured uncertainty, or twist it to their own ends, is beyond your control. Later historians, reading judicial papyri and inscriptions, will debate how much real authority physicians had in such cases. Were they influential advisors, or merely technical specialists, called in after decisions had already been made? Did they stand close to the centers of power, or were they kept at arm's length to avoid the taint of blame? The evidence is fragmentary, and scholars will argue different positions. From inside your own life, the answer feels shifting. Some days, you are treated as a trusted confidant. Other days, you sense a thin, sharp edge of suspicion beneath the polite words. To protect yourself, you cultivate certain habits. You keep careful written records of your treatments, not only for your own mind but in case later questions arise. You share decisions with the older court physician or with trusted colleagues, so that no single pair of hands can be easily singled out as responsible. You avoid aligning yourself too obviously with any particular faction at court. You treat royal wives and their children with equal attention, regardless of their rank in the succession. You know that, in a world where the king's body is both a symbol and a prize, neutrality is an ideal, more than a reality, but you pursue it as best you can. And through it all, the work itself goes on. You still grind herbs in quiet rooms, still cool fevers with damp linen, still listen to dreams in the soft hours before dawn. You still place your fingers on the king's wrist and listen for the story his pulse is telling today. The difference is that you now hear, faintly beneath that rhythm, the murmuring chorus of courtiers and scribes, priests and generals, each waiting to interpret the king's health in the language of their own hopes and fears. It is in this tension that you practice your art, one ear tuned to the beating of a single heart, the other to the dangerous whispers that travel along the coiled corridors of power. You cannot silence those whispers, but you can try, day after day, to let your hands and your judgment be guided more by what you see and know than by what others wish were true. There are nights when the palace is quiet, when no messenger knocks at your door and no servant arrives breathless from the king's chamber. On those nights, you might expect to sleep soundly, free for a few hours from the weight of other people's pain. Instead, you often find your mind wandering backwards, not to your successes, but to the faces you could not save. You lie on your reed mat, listening to the muted sounds of Thebes at rest, the distant bark of a dog, the soft creak of a cartwheel somewhere in the darkness, the sigh of the river moving past. A lamp burns low nearby, its small flame making the walls flicker. In that wavering light, memories step forward one by one, like figures emerging from mist. There is the child from the village downstream, the one with the fever that burned for days. You remember how light his body felt when his mother laid him in your arms, as if the heat had already consumed too much of him. You gave him cooling drinks, bathed his forehead, recited old words meant to drive out the unseen enemy in the belly. You saw, with a kind of painful tenderness, how his eyes still followed his mother's movements, even as his strength faded. He died just before dawn on the third day. You can still see the way his mother looked at you when you gave her the news, not accusing, not even surprised, just empty in a way that made your chest hurt. You had done all that your scrolls and your experience could suggest. You knew, from the patterns you have seen in many fevers, that some bodies simply do not turn the corner, that whatever the disease is, it moves faster than your remedies can. Yet the knowledge brings little comfort when you recall the weight of that small hand slipping from your fingers. There is the elderly scribe from Deir el-Medina, whose joints had grown so stiff that each step was a small battle. You treated him for years, oils for his knees and hips, warm compresses, changes in diet, advice on how long to sit at his writing board. He joked with you, as scribes often do, about the irony of his hand remaining nimble while his legs betrayed him. Then, one year, he developed a deep, persistent pain in his chest. He described it as a pressure, as if a stone had been placed under his ribs. Some days it eased, other days it returned stronger. You tried all the measures you knew, purgatives, rest, gentle walks, even certain ritual baths. Nothing changed the slow downward arc. One morning, he did not wake. The men of the village carried him out, wrapped carefully, to the west, where the tombs he had helped write for others waited to receive him. You know, now, that there is a limit to what anyone can do for a failing heart. You knew, even then, that there were ailments the old texts call matters, with which one contends, rather than matters one can treat. Still, when you think of him, you feel a prick of doubt. Could you have done something differently? Could you have seen some early sign more clearly? And there are palace failures too, heavier because of what they mean for so many others. A royal child whose cough did not respond to any syrup or poultice. A lesser wife of the king whose difficult childbirth ended with both mother and infant slipping away despite all your efforts, and the efforts of midwives trained since their own girlhoods. In those moments, the walls of the palace seem to recede, and you see only the human bodies before you, as vulnerable as any farmers or potters. But afterwards, the reverberations begin: questions in the corridors, murmured laments in the shrines, the subtle shift in the king's gaze when he looks at you across the chamber. You are trained to classify illness, to say, this is an ailment I can treat, this is one with which I will contend, this is one for which nothing can be done. Those phrases, inherited from old case texts, are meant to guide action and protect honesty. They acknowledge that a healer's power is not absolute, yet in the stillness of your own thoughts, you sometimes feel those neat divisions blur. Was that last case truly beyond help, or did your own limits make it so? Where does the boundary lie between the inevitable and the simply unknown? You seek answers in the places that shaped you. In the house of life, you reread passages you once copied as a student. You linger over remedies that failed you in practice, wondering if you prepared them imperfectly, or if their value was always more limited than their confident lines suggest. You consult older colleagues, asking them, without naming names, how they have lived with repeated loss. Some respond with pious certainty. It was the will of the gods. We are instruments, nothing more. Others answer with a shrug that hides, but does not erase, a shadow in their eyes. Outside the official spaces of medicine and ritual, you see how ordinary people try to make sense of these same questions. At the edges of tomb chapels, small letters are left, petitions to the dead, asking for help with illness, injustice, quarrels. These letters to the deceased, scattered across the generations, reveal a belief that those who have gone west can still intervene in the living world. A woman might write to her dead husband, asking why their child is sick, begging him to stop troubling the boy if he is the cause. A man might blame an illness on a broken vow, promising offerings if only his pain stops. You do not dismiss these practices. You know enough about grief to see that giving it words is itself a kind of balm. In your quieter moments, you even feel a kinship with these letter writers. They are, in their own way, doing what you do when you grind herbs or recite a spell, reaching across the unknown, hoping to touch something that can respond. Historians in far-off times will sometimes write about ancient Egyptian physicians as if they were entirely confident within their system, certain that their combination of remedies and rituals formed a complete answer to illness. Others will emphasize how much they must have been aware of their limits, pointing to the very existence of categories like an ailment with which one will contend as evidence of sober realism. The truth, from where you lie staring at your ceiling, feels layered. You move between conviction and doubt like a boat between currents. On some days, you feel that your craft is solid. You have seen what it can do, the lives it has saved or eased. On other days, you feel the edge of a vast darkness beyond your lamp's small circle of light. This hidden doubt does not paralyze you. If anything, it sharpens your attention. When a new patient is led in, you listen a little more closely than you did in your youth. You ask one more question about when the pain began, one more question about what they eat, where they sleep, whom they live with. You look for patterns you might have missed before. You experiment, cautiously, at the margins of tradition, adjusting doses, changing the timing of treatments, recording what happens. You know that every improvement you make may remain unnamed in the texts, but it will live on in the hands of those you teach and in the bodies that heal because of it. Yet you also understand that some questions have no clear answer within your lifetime. Why does one person recover from a fever, while another, seemingly similar, does not? Why does one wound refuse to fester, while another, cleaned in the same way, grows hot and deadly? Why does a king survive a dangerous illness, while a child in a nearby village dies from something that, at first glance, seemed less severe? You can point to differences in strength, in diet, in care. You can invoke the favor or displeasure of the gods. But beneath all those explanations lies a stubborn core of mystery. On certain evenings, when you walk alone along the riverbank at dusk, you feel that mystery pressing close. The sky over Thebes is painted in deep reds and golds, the western cliffs darkening as the sun sinks behind them, the land of the dead taking back its light for the night. Boats glide past, their silhouettes black against the water. Somewhere, a temple drum sounds, marking the rhythm of an evening ritual. You think of the Hall of Judgment described in funerary texts, where the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Mart. You have recited those scenes for others, ensuring that their hearts would not betray them in the presence of Osiris. One day, your own heart will be placed on that scale. When you imagine that moment, you do not picture debates about individual cases, about whether you chose this herb or that, this spell or that. You imagine instead being asked a simpler question. Did you attend to suffering with all the honesty and care you could muster, knowing that you would never see the full pattern? Did you allow your uncertainty to keep you humble and alert, not numb and withdrawn? The answer to that question is not written on any papyrus. It is inscribed slowly, day by day, in the quiet choices you make, when no one but you and your patient will ever know. It is there when you admit, softly, that you do not know whether a remedy will work, but will try it anyway. It is there when you tell a family the truth about a failing body without hiding behind easy assurances. It is there when you sit a little longer at a bedside in the last hours, not because you can change the outcome, but because leaving feels like a kind of abandonment. And so, even as you carry your doubts like small stones in your chest, you rise each morning, wash your hands, and return to your work. You open the jars, unroll the scrolls, lay your fingers on pulses. You know that you will fail again, that grief will visit your practice as surely as the Nile will rise. You also know that the only way to honor both the living and the dead is to let your uncertainty deepen your compassion rather than your fear. In that way, the hidden doubt inside you becomes not a weakness, but a quiet, steady companion, one that reminds you, day after day, that in the space between human hands and the gods, there is still room to do good. By the time your hair begins to thin and grey at the temples, you notice that people have started to look at you differently. It is not just the way servants bow a little lower when you pass, or the extra deference junior officials show in the palace corridor. It is the way younger eyes linger on your hands as you work, the way they watch the arc of your reed pen as it moves across papyrus. You have become, without quite meaning to, what your own teachers once were to you, a repository of experience, a living bridge between the old scrolls and the fresh, uncertain bodies of new students. One morning, you stand again in the courtyard of the House of Life, the same temple complex where you first learned to shape letters and grind herbs. The columns still rise around you, carved and painted with gods and kings, though some of the colors have faded a little more since your youth. A group of boys and young men waits nearby, reed pens tucked behind their ears, wooden writing boards in hand. Their heads are shaved, their eyes bright, their movements restless. A senior priest introduces them as new apprentices to the healing arts, sons of scribes, minor officials, perhaps even a distant relative of a noble family. You look at them and feel a small, wry smile tug at the corner of your mouth. They seem so slight to be entrusted one day with other people's pain, so eager to please, so unaware of how heavy a pulse can feel under your fingers when the person it belongs to is a king. Yet you also remember how your own teachers must have looked at you with similar doubts, and how, over time, practice and patience carved new lines into you that no one could have predicted from your young face. The first lessons you give them look much like the ones you once received. You hand out tablets coated with smooth plaster, show them how to hold the reed, how to dip it into ink made from soot and water and gum. You dictate lines from old wisdom texts, from earlier medical cases, from hymns to Thoth. Their first attempts are clumsy, signs too tall or too short, lines that slant upward like boats on a restless river. You correct them gently, sometimes tracing a shape over their own hand so they can feel the motion in their muscles. As they progress, you begin to introduce more specialized material. You unroll a copy of an old medical scroll, its fibers papery and dry beneath your fingers, its columns of hieratic script dense and familiar. You see their eyes widen at the neat headings. Instructions for a wound in the head that penetrates to the bone. Instructions for an ailment of the belly that rises like fire. Instructions for pains in the joints of a man who is old. You teach them how to read these entries as more than recipes. Look, you say, at how the ancient author moves from examination to prognosis to treatment. See how he tells you not only what to do, but when to admit that nothing can be done. You point out where your own experience has confirmed these judgments and where you have found grounds to modify them. You do so carefully, always with respect for the text, but also with the quiet confidence that comes from decades of standing between written words and living bodies. Some of your apprentices are drawn more to the ritual side of healing. They lean forward when you recite incantations meant to drive out illness, their lips moving softly as they memorize the phrasing. They ask detailed questions about which gods to invoke for which symptoms, about which days are favorable or unfavorable for particular rites. You encourage their piety but remind them, with stories from your practice, that words alone are rarely enough. You describe how honey on a wound, correctly applied, has saved limbs, how clean bandages changed regularly have preserved lives that might otherwise have slipped away, despite the most fervent prayers. Other apprentices are more interested in the practical tasks. They crowd around the grinding stones, eager to crush herbs and minerals, to measure doses, to practice tying bandages on one another's arms and legs. You show them how to judge the consistency of a salve, how to feel when a mixture has been ground fine enough, how tightly a bandage must be wrapped to support a joint without cutting off circulation. In these small, repeated motions, you see yourself as you once were, before palace politics and epidemics left their deeper marks. From time to time, you take one or two of the more promising students with you into the city, or even, on rare occasions, to the palace itself. At the workers' village on the west bank, you let them observe as you examine a craftsman's swollen knee or a child's rash. At Deir el-Medina, where ostraca inscribed with trial letters and practice sentences litter the ground near the scribal houses, you point to the overlap between writing and healing. Here, you say, men who carve the king's tombs also record their own illnesses, their absences from work, their need for ration support. The same hand that draws a god in profile can also note sick in his house beside a worker's name. In the palace, you are more selective about whom you bring. A single careless glance or unguarded whisper in those halls can have consequences you would never wish on a student. But occasionally, when the king's ailment is minor, a strained muscle, a mild digestive trouble, you ask permission for a young apprentice to stand quietly at the edge of the chamber and watch. You remember the first time you were allowed to do the same, how the sight of the king at rest, stripped of regalia, made you re-evaluate everything you thought you knew about power and fragility. You instruct the apprentice beforehand, speak only when spoken to, observe every detail, remember that the king is both man and symbol. Afterwards, in a quiet corridor or back in the temple, you discuss what they saw. Did they notice the way the king held his shoulders? Did they observe the way courtiers reacted when you pronounced him improving or still in need of rest? You want them to understand that healing at this level is as much about reading the room as reading the pulse. Historians in future centuries will look at the fragmentary evidence for how Egyptian physicians were trained and argue about its exact contours. They will point to titles like Chief Physician of the South and North, to references in tomb inscriptions to men who served the king as his doctor, to traces of medical knowledge in the temple schools. Some will suggest that training was highly formalized, others that it was more an apprenticeship system woven through temple and palace life. From where you stand, with ink on your fingers and a young student watching your hands, it feels like both. There is structure, the house of life, the scrolls, the ranks of priests, and there is the lived, improvisational passing on that happens when one person shows another how to wrap a bandage just so, or when to admit that a case has moved beyond human help. You also find yourself teaching not just techniques, but attitudes. You tell your students stories of your failures, not to discourage them, but to inoculate them against arrogance. You describe cases where overconfidence delayed a necessary change in treatment, or where a refusal to admit ignorance harmed more than it helped. You speak of the need to balance reverence for tradition with the willingness to learn from what unfolds in front of you. The old texts are anchors, you say, but they are not chains. At the same time, you caution them against the opposite danger, the temptation to cast aside inherited wisdom too quickly. You have seen remedies that sounded strange on papyrus prove their worth in practice, and others that seemed perfectly sensible do little or nothing. You encourage them to test, to observe, to keep records of their own, adding small notes in the margins of scrolls or on ostraca, as you have done. In doing so, you help them see themselves not just as recipients of a finished body of knowledge, but as contributors to an ongoing conversation that stretches back through generations. Occasionally, a particularly gifted student asks a question that pierces deeper than the rest. Master, he might say, how do you know when to tell a family that nothing more can be done? Or, how do you decide whether an illness comes from the gods or from the body alone? You answer as honestly as you can, knowing that no words will fully prepare them for the weight of those moments. You speak about patterns you have seen, about the importance of not giving false hope, about the need to attend to the patient's peace of mind as much as their symptoms. You admit, quietly, that some doubts never go away. In these conversations, you glimpse the shape of your own legacy, not in monuments or official titles, but in the way these young physicians will think and feel long after your own heart has been weighed in the West. They will stand in rooms you will never see, in reigns you will not live to witness, and they will carry with them echoes of your voice, the insistence on careful observation, the respect for scrolls and stars, the humility before mystery. As the sun sets one evening behind the cliffs of western Thebes, painting the necropolis in shades of deep purple and gold, you sit with a small group of students on the flat roof of the House of Life. Below, the city hums quietly. Above, the first stars appear. You point out Sopdet's first hint on the horizon, recalling for them how its rising marks the flood and the new year. You tell them that just as the river renews the fields, each generation of healers must renew the practice of medicine, drawing from the same source, but letting it flow in slightly new patterns as it encounters new banks, new bends. In that moment, surrounded by young faces turned to the sky, you feel a calm that is different from the relief of a fever breaking or a wound healing cleanly. It is the calm of knowing that, when your own hands are no longer here to grind herbs or feel pulses, others will step forward, shaped in part by all the days and nights you have lived. The House of Life will go on recording, the Nile will go on rising and falling, and somewhere, a student who once watched you tie a bandage will be teaching another pair of hands to do it, passing along, in gestures and words, a way of seeing that once began for you as ink on papyrus and the steady voice of an older man in a quiet room. In the years when your steps grow slower on the temple stairs and your apprentices begin to carry the heavier jars for you, your attention turns more and more to the things that will outlast your bones. You have spent decades pressing fingers to pulses, cooling fevers, setting bones, listening to dreams. Those moments are vivid, but fleeting. What remains, once the patient walks away or is carried to the West, are the marks you leave in ink. You sit once again in the inner rooms of the House of Life, but now not as a student copying others' words. You sit as someone whose own experience is being quietly woven into the library. Around you, the air is dry and cool. High, narrow windows admit thin shafts of light that fall onto rows of wooden chests and shelves. From some of those chests, scribes draw out scrolls that are already old in your time, collections of remedies and observations compiled in the days of kings long dead, perhaps in the early New Kingdom, or even before. Later ages will name some of these treasures. The long, dense roll we now think of as the Ebers papyrus, with its hundreds of prescriptions. The surgical treatise that will be called the Edwin Smith papyrus, with its sober case descriptions. You know these scrolls by their contents, not by any future scholar's label. Their fibers crackle faintly when unrolled. The ink, once dark and wet under a brush, now lies matte and deep brown against the faded yellow of the papyrus. You have copied many passages from them over the years, but today, your task is different. Today, you are helping to decide what will be included when a new compilation is made. A fresh scroll meant to gather the most useful knowledge for physicians of your generation and those yet to come. You sit at a low table while a younger scribe, one of your former students, kneels beside you with writing board and ink. Before you lies a draft scroll filled with trial entries and corrections, treatments that have impressed you in practice, others that you have tested and found wanting, observations about epidemics and wounds and fevers gathered from both temple and palace. You run your finger along the lines, pausing where your own hand has written small notes in the margins. Over the years, works quickly. For older men, lessen the dose, seems ineffective in children. Write this, you say, and the scribe dips his reed pen. You begin to dictate not from memory alone, but from the layered memory that links written text and lived experience. If you encounter a man whose belly is like a pot, hard and painful, whose breath is short, whose face is pale, you begin. You shall say, "This is an ailment with which I will contend." You describe the examination, the signs that distinguish this condition from a simpler disturbance of food or drink. You dictate the treatment you have found most helpful, perhaps a particular sequence of purgatives, followed by rest, light foods, and a specific cooling draught. You include, where tradition demands, a short incantation to be spoken as the medicine is given, not because you believe the words alone are sufficient, but because you have seen how patients respond when their suffering is acknowledged in ritual form as well as in physical care. You move on to cases of wounds. You dictate instructions for cleaning cuts acquired in battle or building, wash with wine or beer, remove foreign matter, apply honey, bandage with clean linen. You distinguish between wounds that gape and those that are shallow, between injuries to limbs and those near vital organs. You borrow formulations from the old surgical text, where they align with your own experience, but you alter others, adding your own cautions and preferences. You insist, for example, on recording how often bandages should be changed in the hot months. When flies are thick and infection comes quickly, your scribe writes in black ink for the main text, in red for headings and important warnings. The alternation of colors gives the scroll a visual rhythm, a pattern that future readers will follow with their eyes as they trace down the columns. At the end of a particularly important section, you instruct him to add a phrase you have seen in older documents. It is effective, a truly excellent remedy. You do not use these words lightly. They are a kind of oath etched in ink. Before you ask another physician, perhaps one not yet born, to trust a recipe marked in this way, you think of the patients whose recovery has convinced you. You are keenly aware that your position serving both temple and palace gives your voice special weight in this process. A remedy you endorse may become standard practice far beyond Thebes. A caution you include may save a physician in another nome from repeating a mistake you once made. This power humbles you. It also pushes you toward clarity. You decide to add, in some places, brief notes on when not to use certain strong measures. Do not purge a man whose strength is already greatly diminished. You dictate in one line. You will hasten his end. Historians centuries from now will examine such phrases and see in them evidence of a familiar thoughtfulness, a concern not to overtreat, an awareness that intervention can harm as well as help. They will debate which parts of the text stem from a single original author and which are the accumulated contributions of many hands. From where you sit, with the reed pen scratching softly beside you, the answer is simple. These scrolls are voices layered on voices. An older healer speaks in one line. Your own voice follows in the next. A future physician may add a short note in the margin, quietly correcting you where experience proves you slightly wrong. You also help decide what to leave out. There are remedies you have tried that seem to do little, elaborate combinations of rare substances whose practical value is not clear. There are spells whose words have grown obscure, their original context lost. You do not forbid their use, but you choose not to give them pride of place in the new compilation. In an age when papyrus, while precious, can still be obtained in long rolls, this act of omission is gentle, not absolute. Yet even choosing what not to inscribe has consequences. What you do not write may, over time, fade from practice. In a corner of the room, a chest stands partially open, revealing older scrolls rolled and tied. Some bear short colophons at their ends, notes written by earlier scribes. Year X, under the majesty of King Y, copied from an old writing found in the House of Life, examined and found correct. You feel a kinship with those anonymous predecessors. Like you, they sat with reeds and ink, weighing which inherited phrases should be carried forward and which should be quietly retired. You instruct your scribe to add a similar note at the end of this new scroll when it is complete. It will mention the current reign, perhaps of a ruler like Ramesses II, or one of his successors, the place of copying, and a brief statement of confidence. You do not imagine that future scholars will pore over these lines, arguing about dates and sources. You simply want the next physician who opens the roll to feel that someone before him took care with what it contains. From time to time, as the work stretches over many days and weeks, you pause and flex your fingers, feeling the stiffness in your joints. Your eyes blur if you read too long by lamplight. You are reminded that your own body, too, is a kind of papyrus used, worn, its fibers beginning to fray. The scroll you are helping to shape, however, may outlive you by generations. It may be stored in this temple, or carried to another city, or placed eventually in a tomb as part of someone's grave goods. Wherever it travels, it will carry traces of your mind, your judgments, your memories of fevers and fractures and recoveries. Later, those who study such documents will sometimes imagine the authors as distant, almost abstract figures, a redactor, a compiler, a scribe. They will analyze the text line by line, comparing phrases, identifying repetitions, reconstructing layers. From inside your own life, the work feels more intimate. Each line you dictate is connected to a face, a voice, a heartbeat you once felt under your hand. When at last the new scroll is finished, dried, and rolled, it rests for a moment on the table before you like a sleeping creature. You place your palm gently on its surface, feeling the faint ridges of the papyrus beneath your skin. You think of the young physician who will one day untie its cord, unroll it, and bend over its columns with the same mixture of hope and anxiety you once carried. You hope that, when they read the words, it is effective. They will hear not only your confidence, but also your humility, the unspoken understanding that even the best remedy is an offering, not a guarantee. Then you nod to the scribe, and together you carry the scroll to its place among the others. It disappears into the chest, one more roll among many, yet you know that, in some quiet way, a part of your own mind has just been anchored in the house of life. Long after your hands can no longer grind herbs or feel pulses, your thoughts will travel the length of this fragile papyrus, moving silently between the eyes of one healer and the next, like a narrow current flowing on beneath the wide, glittering surface of the Nile. You have spent a lifetime standing beside other people's beds, other people's sick rooms, other people's thresholds, between this world and the next. There comes a point when you cannot avoid imagining your own. It does not arrive all at once, like a shout. It comes instead, in small, quiet thoughts, on days when your knees ache as you climb the temple steps, or when your fingers need a moment longer to loosen before they can unroll a scroll. One afternoon, you cross the Nile toward the West Bank, as you have done many times to treat workmen or attend minor officials. The river is calm, its surface broken now and then by the flick of a fish or the arc of an oar. On the eastern bank behind you, Thebes shines in the sun, the pylons of Karnak, the great colonnade of Luxor, the spreading clusters of houses. Ahead, the cliffs of the necropolis rise, pale and stern, marking the land of the dead. You have travelled this route for years, visiting Deir el-Medina, the village where the royal tomb workers live, and the valleys beyond, where kings of the new kingdom, Thutmose, Amenhotep, Ramesses are laid in hidden tombs cut deep into stone. You know the paths between the walled village of the tomb and the royal necropolis, the tracks leading to the tomb chapels, where families leave offerings long after a funeral. Today, though, as you walk among the houses and see men carving shabti figures, small servant statues, intended to work for the dead in the next world, you feel something shift. You no longer see only other people's afterlives. You begin to imagine your own. You pass near one of the places where embalmers work, a waybit, a pure tent or house of purification set apart from ordinary dwellings. The smell here is distinctive: natron drying flesh, resins warming over small fires, the faint tang of oils. You have always avoided lingering too long at the threshold. Your work deals with living bodies, not those already on their way westward. Yet, over years, you have seen enough to understand the outline of the process. You know that when a man of some standing dies, whether a king in a palace at Malkata or a well-respected craftsman in Thebes, his body is brought to such a place. There, specialists trained in funerary craft begin the long preparation that can last 70 days. Washing, packing with natron, treating with oils, wrapping in linen. Organs are removed with skill you have glimpsed only rarely, placed in jars under the protection of the 4 sons of Horus Imstati for the liver, Hapi for the lungs, Duamutef for the stomach, Kibe Senuef for the intestines, or, in later practice, treated and returned to the body. The heart, seat of memory and conscience, is left in place. It will be needed. You stand a little way off and imagine your own body lying on that embalmer's table one day. You picture the men who will bend over you, their hands steady and practiced, not unlike your own when you set bones or bind wounds. Some may even have learned from your concerns about cleanliness and careful handling. Knowledge flows both ways between embalmers and physicians. You trust them more than you once did. For years, you saw their work mostly as a religious craft. Now, with your own limbs growing slower, you see it also as a final form of care. In your mind, the boundary between your practice and theirs blurs. You have always thought of the body as a house of channels, with the heart at the center. Embalmers, in their way, confirm this. They remove what can decay quickly, treat what must endure, and wrap the whole in layer upon layer of linen, each bandage, perhaps accompanied by murmured words from texts you know well, spells from the funerary collections. Later generations will call the Book of Going Forth by Day, or Book of the Dead, on painted papyri placed in tombs from the time of the 18th dynasty onward. You have seen those spells written beside images of the deceased, navigating the dangers of the duat, the underworld. You have provided such papyri for others, advised on which chapters to include, ensured that the name of the deceased is written correctly so that it will be spoken by the gods. Now you begin to think about which words you would want near you. A spell to give you a cool breeze in the afterlife, perhaps, or one to allow you to go out into the day with the sun god Re, returning each evening to your tomb as safely as the sun returns to the western horizon. The scene that comes to you most often is the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart is weighed against the feather of Maat. You have recited its description countless times for others, ensuring that they know how to address Osiris, how to greet Anubis, how to keep their hearts from betraying them. In your own imagination, you see yourself standing there, no longer as a physician observing other people's fears, but as a soul whose life is under review. You picture your heart placed on one side of a balance, the feather of Maat on the other. The hall is quiet, the gods watch. Thoth stands ready to record the outcome. Amit, the devourer, waits nearby, a composite creature that you have seen carved on tomb walls. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. You know, from studied texts, that if the heart is too heavy laden with wrongdoing, cruelty, neglect, it will be fed to her, and the soul will be lost. What will be written, you wonder, in that moment? Not the details of each remedy you chose or each scroll you copied, but the pattern formed by countless small decisions. Did you tell the truth when it mattered? Did you comfort those you could not cure? Did you allow your power over vulnerable bodies to be shaped by kindness rather than vanity? These questions haunt you more than any particular misdiagnosis. Historians far in the future will debate how literally Egyptians took such scenes. Were they precise descriptions of expected experience after death, or more symbolic assurances that justice ultimately prevails? They will analyze tomb paintings at places like Deir el-Medina and the Valley of the Kings, count the number of copies of certain Book of the Dead chapters, and argue over whether common people understood the theology in detail. From your vantage point, the line between symbol and reality is soft. You do not ask whether the scales and feather exist exactly as painted. You ask whether living as if they do makes your choices in this world better aligned with Maat. You also imagine the more practical side of your own funeral. In your mind's eye, you see your body, wrapped in linen, placed in a wooden coffin, painted with protective figures and texts. Perhaps a second, inner coffin nests inside the first, as you have seen in burials of respected officials during the Ramesside period. You picture a small carved image of you on the lid, arms crossed, holding the signs of protection. You imagine the procession moving from the riverbank up to your tomb, a modest one, compared to the vast chambers of kings and queens, but arranged with care. Inside that tomb, you see the objects that will accompany you, a few pieces of furniture, jars of grain and beer, the tools of your trade. Perhaps your family or apprentices will place a small chest of writing implements near your head, a palette with black and red pigment, a selection of reeds, a roll of papyrus. Maybe they will include a few simple instruments of your craft, A small mortar and pestle, a bundle of linen bandages, a jar etched with signs indicating a favorite healing salve. These are not just curiosities, they are, in the Egyptian imagination, tools you might need in the next world, where fields must be tilled and communities need healers as surely as this one does. You even allow yourself a quiet, almost playful thought that in the afterlife, somewhere along the reed-filled field of reeds described in tomb texts, there might be a clinic of sorts, a place where the dead, still bearing the marks of their earthly lives, come for easing of old pains. You know that the texts focus more on eternal abundance than on continued suffering, but you cannot help imagining yourself sitting in a shaded portico there, once again feeling pulses, once again offering salves, but with time no longer pressing so sharply, and with the knowledge that death, this time, has already done its worst. In that imagined scene, you find a kind of comfort. It weaves together all the strands that have shaped your life. The practical knowledge of herbs and bandages, the ritual language of spells and hymns, the cosmic vision of a universe governed by Ma'at. Whether or not the afterlife will match these images exactly, they give shape to your hope that what you have learned and practiced does not vanish with your last breath. So when you step away from the Wabbit and look up at the cliffs glowing in the late light, you feel less fear than you might have in your youth. You know that your body will one day lie on one of those polished tables, that your skin will feel the drying touch of natron, that your limbs will be enclosed in linen, that your name will be spoken in prayers by those you leave behind. You also know that your heart, with all its doubts and efforts, will be weighed according to a standard you have tried to honor since your first days as a student under the temple's painted ceilings. And as you turn back toward the river, staff tapping softly on the path, you carry with you a quiet trust that the same care you have lavished on the bodies of others will, in the end, be extended to your own, and that the knowledge written in scrolls and muscles during your lifetime will accompany you in ways you cannot fully imagine, into whatever careful, measured dawn awaits beyond the western horizon. In the last stretch of your life, the days grow slower but no less full. You still wake early, still wash your hands in cool water, still feel for pulses and listen to complaints. Yet almost every action now carries a faint double image, yourself as you are and yourself as you will be remembered or forgotten. Sometimes, in a quiet moment in the house of life, you find your gaze drifting from the scroll you are reading to the walls around you. The paint there has begun to flake in places. A few signs are already hard to make out, their lines softened by time and dust. You know that, beyond the temple's outer walls, wind and sun are working the same slow changes on everything men have built. Columns crack, courtyards flood, houses crumble and are rebuilt. Memory, like mortar, needs tending. You walk through Thebes with this awareness. At Karnak, you pass the great hypostyle hall whose forest of columns has witnessed the festivals of kings like Seti I and Ramesses II. In Luxor, you see reliefs of processions that you yourself have attended, captured in idealized form, priests carrying barkeys, the king striding beneath banners. In the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, you recognize faces in the narrow streets, men whose fractures you have set, women whose fevers you have cooled, children who once clung shyly to their mother's skirts when you entered a room. You know, in your clearer moments, that the individual traces you leave here are fragile. The jars you have filled with salves will be emptied and reused. The bandages you have tied will be discarded or buried. The words you have spoken over sickbeds will drift away, carried off like smoke. What will remain, if anything does, are the things written down and the shapes cut into stone, the medical scrolls you helped compile, the brief lines on someone's tomb chapel wall that mention a physician who served the palace, the little notes you and your students have scratched on ostraka and tucked into baskets. You do not know that, many centuries after your own burial, Thebes will decline as a royal city, that new capitals will rise in the north, that foreign powers will rule Egypt, that languages and scripts will change. You do not know that the temples where you taught will be repurposed, buried, broken, their columns toppled and half buried in sand. You do not foresee that your scrolls, rolled and stored in chests, will be scattered, some crumbling into dust, others preserved by chance in tombs or dry storerooms, waiting in darkness. Yet, in a way, you sense that your work is part of something longer than any single dynasty. When you wrote your marginal notes beside older remedies, you felt yourself in conversation with men long dead. You imagine that conversation continuing, though you cannot see how. Far, far ahead in time, a different kind of seeker will walk among the ruins of Luxor and the West Bank necropolis. He will not wear linen or shave his head as you do. He will carry metal tools and glass lenses, notebooks and cameras. Columns that to you are bright with fresh paint will rise before him as weathered stone, their colors faded or gone. He will lower himself into tombs by rope and ladder, brushing away centuries of dust from painted walls that still show the Hall of Judgment, the field of reeds, and jars that look very much like the ones you handle every day. In one of those tombs, or perhaps in the debris of an ancient settlement, he or someone like him will find a rolled papyrus sealed in resin and linen. Very carefully, he will soften the layers, unroll the brittle sheets, and see the familiar alternation of black and red ink. He will not read your script at first. To him, the curved lines and crowded signs will be a puzzle. But over time, others will learn to decipher them. They will give these scrolls names: Ebers, Smith, Cahun, Chester Beatty. They will sit in rooms lit by oil lamps and, later, by other, brighter lights, tracing the same phrases you once copied by hand. They will find, embedded in those texts, echoes of your thought. They will read diagnostic phrases like an ailment I can treat, an ailment with which I will contend, an ailment for which nothing can be done, and recognize in them something very human, a healer's attempt to face uncertainty honestly. They will see recipes that use honey on wounds and understand, through their own sciences, why such a practice helped. They will find references to hearts and vessels, and wonder exactly how much you knew about the body's inner pathways. Historians will argue, some emphasizing your rational observations, others pointing to the spells that sit beside them. In doing so, they will be reconstructing, in their own language, the very balance you have lived with all your life. In shattered tombs and wrapped bandages, they will also examine the bodies of kings you have treated, or whose reigns you have lived through, using methods you cannot imagine, cutting no flesh, yet seeing bone and vessel within. They will find signs of diseases you knew only by their outer marks. In hardened arteries and worn joints, they will recognize the same patterns of strain and age that your fingers felt through skin. They will see, in the curve of a spine or the repair of a fractured limb, the quiet testimony of physicians like you. They will never know your personal name with certainty. Perhaps a fragment of it survives on a damaged stela. Perhaps it is lost entirely. But in the combination of precise case descriptions, practical remedies, and ritual invocations, they will catch glimpses of your inner world. A mind that held together gods and herbs, stars and pulses, doubt and duty. And somewhere, perhaps in a museum far from the Nile, a modern visitor will stand in front of a glass case, holding a copy of a medical papyrus. The room will be quiet, the air faintly cool. Outside, the traffic of a city entirely unlike Thebes will murmur. Inside, the visitor will lean closer, tracing the columns of signs with their eyes, reading a translation on a plaque, instructions for examining a head wound, for treating a fever, for easing pain in old joints. They will imagine the physician who once spoke these words, who once bent over a patient in a room lit by flickering lamps. In that moment, across thousands of years, your life will brush against theirs like a whisper. They will not feel your hand on their wrist or hear your voice, but they will sense the shape of your thought, the way you tried to make sense of suffering with the tools available to you, the way you accepted limits without surrendering care. Some scholars might still argue about how advanced your medicine was, whether it deserves certain labels. Others will simply feel a quiet respect. Historians often debate whether individuals like you truly live on through texts and bodies, or whether what survives is only an impersonal residue of a lost world. You, standing in your own fading sunlight, might answer that the distinction hardly matters. What matters is that the impulse to heal, to steady trembling hands, to cool burning skin, to learn from each failure and pass that learning forward continues. And so, as your own days fold toward their close, you find yourself less afraid of being forgotten. You have woven your thoughts into papyrus and students' minds, into bones that have been set straight and scars that have healed cleanly. You have walked the line between gods and flesh, between scroll and wound, as carefully as you could. Whatever future eyes may see of this, it is enough. You return from the West Bank one evening as the sun sinks behind the cliffs, turning them a deep, soft red. The boat rocks gently beneath your feet. The river smells of water and mud and distant reeds. On the eastern shore, lamps begin to glow in the palace and temple, pinpricks of light in the gathering blue. You feel the boat slide forward, carrying you toward home, and you let your shoulders relax. For tonight, at least, no messenger is waiting. Your hands may rest. You step onto the quay, walk slowly through the cooling streets, and enter your familiar rooms in the house of life. A student greets you, takes your pouch, sets out a small meal. Later, as you lie down and feel the day slide away, the echo of many pulses still wandering through your fingertips, you understand that you are just one point in a long, unbroken line of healers who have watched the same stars rise over the Nile. That knowledge, more than any monument, is what lets your breath ease and your eyes drift closed. Now the story itself begins to soften, like the light in a temple hall after the last worshipper has gone. The oil lamps you have imagined burning on polished stone start to gutter and shrink, their little flames bowing low, throwing longer, gentler shadows over painted walls. The corridors of the palace empty. The echo of sandals on stone fades into a deep, velvety hush. Outside, the broad back of the Nile turns dark, carrying only the faintest sheen of starlight. The great columns of Karnak and Luxor, which by day hold thousands of carved figures and hieroglyphs in their embrace, now stand quietly under the night sky. Bats wheel silently between them. A cool wind slips along their fluted sides. The necropolis on the west bank lies still, its tomb doors closed, its painted chambers resting in a darkness that is not threatening now, only patient. All the worries over fevers and fractures, all the whispered court intrigues around a king's sickbed, have sunk back into the sand, where centuries pile softly on top of one another. Far away in another age, a museum gallery closes for the evening. Visitors drift out. Lights are dimmed until only a few small lamps glow over glass cases. Behind one pane of glass, a brown, fragile scroll rests in careful folds, its ink older than any city outside. No one is reading it at this moment. It simply lies there, like a sleeping thought. Shelves of books in nearby rooms stand in orderly rows, their pages closed. Even the scholars who argue about your world have gone home, leaving their notes and magnifying lenses stacked neatly on desks. Here, in your own room, wherever you are listening from tonight, the same quiet begins to settle. The sounds outside your window grow softer, distant traffic fading, a neighbor turning off a light, perhaps the hum of a fan or the last footsteps in a corridor. Your blankets weigh pleasantly over you like layers of linen, but without any of the ancient worlds, heaviness, only warmth, only safety. The centuries we have wandered through together fold themselves back up like a scroll returned gently to its chest. Dust drifts down in the imagined temples. The river glides on. The physicians of long ago close their eyes. You remain here, in your own present, heart beating steadily in your chest, breath moving in and out with the same quiet rhythm that guided so many of their examinations. The past, with all its strange customs and careful remedies, has done what it can for you. It has kept you company as you drift towards sleep, shown you that even in very distant times, people tried to care for one another as best they could. The turmoil, the uncertainty, the unanswered questions, all of that belongs to history now. So, as the last lamps of ancient Egypt go dark in your imagination, you can let your own room grow dim, your thoughts slow, your body soften against the bed. Somewhere, beyond your ceiling, beyond the layers of air and cloud, the same stars that watched over Thebes turn slowly in their courses. They have seen many worlds rise and fall. Tonight, they keep a quiet, indifferent vigil while you rest. And that, strangely, is its own kind of comfort. And as history closes its heavy books for the night, the quiet stars of another age watch over your dreams.